Something about the stale smell and the dense darkness didn't feel right. I forced myself to keep going, telling myself I was just being dramatic. I should have taken that feeling more seriously. After flipping the light switch and realizing the single bulb was too weak to see most of the basement, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. When I returned to the basement door and opened it, the air felt heavier. I could smell musty furniture, mildew, and something else I couldn't place. The flight of steps down was short, but it seemed to get darker with each step. My flashlight wobbled in my hand because I was trying to balance a box of cleaning supplies on my hip. I had planned on making a quick inspection and maybe tidying up. I didn't plan on staying long. As soon as I reached the bottom, I noticed how cramped it was. Old chairs, tables, and cabinets were piled up. Some were stacked on each other and some leaned against the stone walls. My flashlight beam landed on thick layers of dust and cobwebs in every corner. The air felt warmer down there, but stale, like it hadn't been circulated in years. I swept the light around to get an idea of the space. There were more chairs than I could count, maybe from different decades. I saw an antique dresser with a broken mirror, boxes of outdated tools, and several large trunks that were locked. I wasn't sure what was inside them. My uncle must have tossed every piece of old furniture he didn't want into this basement. When I turned to check the door behind me, it was still open, letting in a small amount of light from the hallway above. I felt more comfortable seeing that sliver of light, but after a while, I started feeling uneasy. Something about the stillness made me keep looking over my shoulder, as if I expected to see someone else there. I reminded myself that it was just a cluttered basement filled with junk. Still, my shoulders felt tense. My jaw was clenched so hard that it hurt. I moved some broken chairs aside so I could walk around a bit. Dust rose from the floor and made me cough. Each step felt like I was stirring up years of neglect. After a few minutes, I noticed the corners seemed darker than they should have been. My flashlight was strong enough to illuminate them, but for some reason, the darkness looked thicker where the walls met the ceiling. It didn't make sense. The more I stared, the more I felt my chest tighten. I told myself I was probably just seeing shadows from the flashlight at a weird angle. My plan was to do a quick check for mold or leaks. I wasn't planning on an in-depth search that day, but the sense of being watched made me hurry. I could almost sense movement just beyond my beam of light, like the shadows were shifting whenever I wasn't looking directly at them. Every time I spun around, I found nothing but dusty junk. I ended up leaving the basement faster than I had intended. I tossed the cleaning supplies in a corner and decided I'd return later with better gear. I climbed the steps, shut off the light, and closed the door behind me. My hands were shaking when I turned the doorknob, but I tried to ignore it. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about the basement, remembering that feeling of being watched, the shadows that didn't quite match my movements. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to faint sounds coming from downstairs. It sounded like something scraping the floor or brushing against a wall. I convinced myself it was just the house settling or a gust of wind. The windows in this old place let in plenty of drafts. I tried to go back to sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I dozed off. The next morning, I decided to check the basement floor in the daylight. I wanted to see if I could find any sign of animals or maybe a broken pipe that could explain the noises. When I went down, the air felt colder than before, and I saw something that made me stop right away. There were footprints on the dusty cement floor, not mine. They looked strange, a bit smaller than my shoe size, but not by much. They trailed off behind a stack of crates. My first thought was that maybe I had made those prints without realizing, but the shape of the footprints didn't match my own. They also had a different tread pattern. I checked my shoes. Definitely not the same. My pulse hammered in my ears. I backed away and stood at the bottom of the stairs, scanning the basement. It was dead silent. I followed the footprints slowly, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. They looped around some old bed frames and ended at a heavy wooden armoire shoved against the far wall. It looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. There was no exit behind it, and the footprints just stopped. I felt something in my stomach clench hard, like I was about to throw up. I backed away, not sure what to do. I decided I would come back with a crowbar to see if there was anything hidden behind that armoire, but at that moment, I just wanted to leave the basement. By midday, I was telling myself I must have missed something obvious. Maybe a homeless person or a squatter used a hidden entrance, or maybe the footprints were an old set that I just never noticed. But the dust seemed fresh, and the prints were crisp. I tried to focus on other tasks around the house. I cleaned the kitchen, vacuumed the living room, and attempted to set up my temporary bedroom. But I kept thinking about those footprints. That afternoon, I also felt a draft in the hallway near the basement door, which was strange because every window upstairs was shut. I checked the weather stripping around the back door. It was intact. I kept feeling these subtle shifts in the air, like a breeze that came and went at odd intervals. Night fell, and I locked every door in the house. I double-checked the kitchen door and made sure the deadbolt was secure. I shut off all the lights except for a small lamp in the living room. I sat on the couch trying to watch TV, hoping it would distract me. The house felt too quiet. Eventually, I turned off the TV and headed to bed, feeling uneasy. I woke up around 2 a.m. to strange creaking sounds. They were soft, but they sounded like footsteps on the floorboards downstairs. My heart pounded as I slid out of bed and listened. I couldn't tell exactly where they were coming from. I crept into the hallway and peered down the stairs. The living room was dark, but something was off. It felt like there was a shape against the dimness. When I blinked, the shape was gone. I held my breath for a few seconds, waiting to see if it would appear again. Nothing moved. I thought maybe I was half asleep and seeing things. Then the TV in the living room turned on by itself. The sudden noise and light made me jump so hard I almost lost my balance on the top step. My mouth went dry. I hurried downstairs, my heart pounding in my ears. The TV was playing static, like it couldn't pick up a channel. I grabbed the remote off the coffee table and turned it off. My hand shook as I placed the remote back down. I spun around, flipping on the light switch. The living room was empty. No one was there. I stood still for a while, listening. The silence made the ringing in my ears more noticeable. Eventually, I turned off the lights and went back upstairs, my stomach twisted in knots. I barely slept the rest of the night, jumping at every little sound the house made. The following day, I got up and headed to the kitchen to make coffee. I noticed the kitchen door was slightly ajar. I could see a bright line of morning light shining in through the crack. I was sure I locked that door. I always check it at night. My jaw tightened as I realized the deadbolt was still in the locked position, but the door was open an inch or two. That didn't make sense. With a shaky hand, I shut the door and tested it a few times. It latched properly. I had no clue how it opened by itself. My palms felt sweaty and my breathing was shallow. I tried to calm down by reminding myself that old houses can have warped frames. Maybe the lock didn't catch properly. That explanation didn't make me feel much better, but I forced myself to carry on. Later in the day, I went back into the basement. I carried a crowbar and a flashlight with fresh batteries. I wanted to move that heavy armoire to check the wall behind it. My plan was to settle the footprints mystery once and for all. It was a struggle to maneuver around the piles of dusty furniture, and the smell of damp wood felt stronger than before. I eventually made it to the armoire. I stuck the crowbar under the edge and tried to pry it away from the wall. It wouldn't budge. It felt wedged, like someone had braced it from the other side. I tried again, putting more weight into it. The armoire shifted maybe half an inch, but then it snapped back into place, nearly pinching my fingers. My heart pounded in my chest as I pictured a hand on the other side pushing it back. That was impossible. I yanked the crowbar free and stepped back, breathing heavily. The air in the basement felt thick and sweat dripped down my temples. I couldn't do it. I dropped the crowbar and left. That night, I tried to sleep with the lights on in my bedroom, but it didn't help. Around midnight, I heard a distinct thump coming from the upstairs hallway. I was on the second floor, so the only thing above me was the attic space, which I had never fully explored. I sat up in bed, listening closely. Another thump echoed. It sounded like a heavy object falling onto the floorboards. My mouth went dry. I put on some pants. grabbed my phone, and stepped into the hallway. The overhead light flickered as I turned it on. I tried to calm myself, but my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I slowly walked to the attic ladder, which was in the hallway ceiling. I pulled it down and climbed up a few steps, shining my phone flashlight around. The attic was half finished, with loose insulation and a few old boxes. There was no one there. Nothing looked out of place. The air smelled stale, and I could see dust swirling in the phone's light. I didn't see any sign of movement. I stood there a moment, confused and scared, then climbed back down and closed the attic door. As I turned back toward my bedroom, I saw a dark shape at the end of the hall. It was only for a second, maybe less, but it was tall, and it was there. My skin broke into goosebumps. I felt cold all over. I blinked and the shape was gone. I walked to that spot, flipping on lights as I went. Nothing was there. My entire body was shaking. I went back to my bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the bed. I told myself I was done ignoring this. Something strange was happening in the house, and it wasn't my imagination. I stayed awake until dawn, feeling every minute stretch out. The next morning, I decided to document everything. I wrote down each incident and the time it happened. I took pictures of the footprints in the basement and recorded any odd sounds on my phone's voice memo app. The tension in my chest felt relentless, but I wanted to have some form of proof in case I needed to show someone. My day passed with me nervously pacing around the house, checking the locks and feeling jumpy whenever a floorboard creaked. That evening, I sat on the couch with the lights on, flipping through TV channels just for background noise. I planned to stay in the living room all night if I had to. As I sat there, the hallway light started flickering. I got up to check it. It stopped flickering when I approached, so I assumed it was a loose bulb. Then the kitchen light turned off by itself. I hurried in there, fumbling for the switch. It was still in the on position, yet the light was out. Suddenly it came back on. My skin felt clammy and I swallowed hard. My eyes darted around the room. The door was closed this time, locked even. But I saw the handle jiggle, just once, like someone had tested it from outside. I rushed over and yanked the door open, expecting to see someone. No one was there. The yard was dark and the trees stood still. There was no wind. I slammed the door and locked it again. When midnight came, the house was silent. I turned off the TV, went to the bathroom, and tried to wash my face with cold water. My reflection in the mirror looked exhausted. My eyes had dark circles under them, and my skin looked pale. I dried my face and turned off the bathroom light. As I walked out, I saw a faint shape in the hallway mirror. It looked like a silhouette behind me, watching me. My muscles tensed, and my throat went tight. When I spun around, there was no one there. I couldn't even move for a few seconds, just stared at the empty hallway. My heart was beating so fast I could hear it in my ears. Finally, I forced myself to take a few steps forward, but my knees felt weak. I went into my bedroom and locked the door again. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening for any sound that would indicate another presence. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. I thought about leaving the house for good, but a stubborn part of me wanted to know what was really happening. Still, every passing moment filled me with a deep sense of dread. Now I sit here, typing this on my phone, hearing a faint scraping coming from somewhere below. It might be in the basement again, or it might be in the walls. I can't tell. My hands are shaking, and my stomach is in knots. My back is against the bedroom door, just in case it tries to open. I want to leave, but I can't bring myself to stand. My legs feel like lead. The house is dark. The electricity flickered out a few minutes ago, and my phone battery is dropping. The only light I have comes from the phone screen. The sounds below haven't stopped. They come in bursts, like something large being dragged across the floor. Then a pause. Then a thump. Each noise feels closer than before. I don't know what it is. I don't even know if I want to find out. But I can't look away from the door. I'm stuck here, waiting, feeling my breath catch in my throat every time another noise echoes up the stairs. This is the reality of inheriting this house. It's not a story I ever thought I'd be telling, but here I am, scared and confused with no plan except to hold on and hope these walls keep whatever's in the basement from coming any closer. I stood in the main hallway with a flashlight in my hand, staring at the exposed framework of the old mansion. My breath came out in short bursts because something felt off. I had started work on this place a week ago, determined to turn it into a comfortable home for my retirement years. It was supposed to be a simple renovation project. I thought I would just tear down a few walls, upgrade the foundation, and install modern fixtures. But from the first night I stepped inside, I heard a voice whisper my name in the darkness. I told myself it was the wind, but deep down, I wasn't convinced. There was no electricity in the mansion and I had no generator. Yet every night, a faint metallic echo called out to me. It said my name slowly, drawn out, like it was reaching through the corridors. I'm not a superstitious man, but I felt my stomach tighten each time the voice spoke. I worked as an architect for over 40 years, and I've seen some strange structures, but this place tops them all. The floors groaned, the walls let out strange moans when the wind pushed against them. The first time I heard the whisper, I stood absolutely still under the flickering beam of my flashlight. I listened for normal sounds, the wind outside, maybe a loose piece of metal, or some leftover scrap from the demolition. But there was nothing. The voice said my name again, so soft it almost disappeared into the night. I felt a chill spread across my back. I tried to shake it off and got back to work. On my second day, I started tearing out some interior walls to open up the space. Old plaster crumbled under my hammer. Rotten wooden studs cracked and snapped under the weight of my crowbar. I felt a draft coming through the cracks in the plaster. It was much colder than I expected. I stopped swinging my hammer for a moment and leaned in, pressing my cheek against the old wallpaper. A strange coldness seeped out, like some air current was behind the wall. It smelled stale and sour, almost metallic. I thought there might be old pipes or maybe some hidden ductwork. That's when I heard the whisper again, coming from right behind the plaster. It spoke my name in the same low, metallic murmur I'd heard before. I shoved away from the wall and nearly lost my balance. My flashlight dropped, and for a second the beam flickered across the floor. In that brief moment I realized I was sweating. My shirt stuck to my back, and my throat felt tight. But I forced myself to keep going. I told myself to stay calm, because I had a job to do. I tried to ignore the voice. I forced myself to tear down the section of wall. By nightfall, I had cleared a wide area near the staircase. Debris lay scattered around me. I picked up the larger pieces and stacked them in a corner so I could haul them out the next morning. Every time I picked up a piece of broken plaster, I half expected something to jump out of the darkness. My flashlight started to flicker a bit, so I replaced the batteries. Even then, the corridor felt too dark. The shadows seemed heavier than normal, but I tried not to linger on that thought. Around 8 at night, I decided to call it a day. I had a small folding cot set up in what used to be the dining room. There wasn't any furniture left in the house, so I placed my cot near the old fireplace. The chimney didn't draw well, so the room smelled musty. I sat there in the dim glow of a lantern, reviewing my progress. The space looked more open, but there were cracks in the floors and walls that needed attention. I started making a mental list of repairs. That's when I heard a clicking sound, like metal tapping against stone. I switched off my lantern to listen better. For a few seconds I heard only silence. Then the whisper started up again, slow and steady, calling out my name like it knew exactly where I was. The hair on my arm stood up. I clenched my fists to stop my hands from shaking. I turned the lantern back on, got out of my cot, and walked toward the corridor. I moved quietly, listening. My heart thumped in my chest. The whisper sounded like it came from behind the walls. I followed the sound into a narrow hallway. My flashlight beam wobbled in front of me. The wood under my feet felt soft in places, like it might give way if I stepped too hard. The voice seemed to retreat when I advanced, leading me deeper into the house. Eventually, I reached a door I hadn't opened yet. It was stiff, and the handle felt cold. like it had been dipped in ice water. When I pushed it open, I found a small storage room, empty except for a few dusty shelves. My flashlight passed over the walls, revealing more cracks. The smell of rust and dampness hit my nose. I listened for the voice, but it was gone. All I heard was my breathing and the faint squeak of old wood under my feet. I stayed there for a minute, waiting, but nothing happened. After that, I went back to my cot and tried to sleep. My rest was shallow because each time I drifted off, I heard faint clicking noises and the rustle of something moving through the corridors. In the morning, I felt groggy and unsettled, but I pushed ahead with my plans. I spent most of the day removing more old plaster. I found metal conduits that led nowhere, some with rusted wiring inside. I examined them carefully, hoping to find an explanation for the whispers. Maybe there was some odd resonance in the pipes, but I didn't see anything that made sense. The wires were dead. There was no sign of a short circuit or anything that might produce a voice-like sound. Around noon, I used a sledgehammer to knock out a section of wall near the front entrance. Dust and debris fell in a cloud, forcing me to cover my mouth. When the dust settled, I noticed an unusual gap behind the studs. There was a narrow space, almost a tunnel running between the walls. I shined my flashlight inside. The beam illuminated a cramped passage full of cobwebs and decaying insulation. The same stale smell poured out. My eyes watered and my chest felt tight. I thought about crawling in, but it looked unstable. The old beams might collapse if I moved around too much. Still, I had a strong urge to see where it went. Something tugged at me, like an itch in the back of my mind. I set the sledgehammer aside and grabbed a small crowbar. Carefully, I widened the opening. Each movement caused more debris to fall. My heart pounded as I pushed some broken lath and plaster out of the way. Then I crawled into that hidden passage. The space was claustrophobic. The beams on either side pressed in close. I felt old spider webs brush my face and arms. My flashlight beam danced on the rough wooden boards. I moved forward on my elbows inch by inch. The floor felt damp. My knees sank slightly into some rotted material. The cold air felt even more intense in there, like I was inside a refrigerator. I heard a faint metallic scrape again, followed by a whisper that sounded closer than ever. It said my name. My mouth felt dry. My heart hammered against my ribs. But I kept going. I needed to know what was hidden back there. I reached a section of the passage where I could almost kneel. I paused to catch my breath. Dust floated in the flashlight beam, making me cough. Then I spotted a small opening ahead. It was a hole in the wall, about the size of a dinner plate, leading into a dark area. I shined my light inside. I couldn't see much except more boards and debris. But I felt a stronger draft, like something was breathing behind the wall. I tried to peer in, my face inches from the hole. Then I heard the whisper again, so close it sent a tremor through my chest. I jerked back and cracked my head against a beam. Pain shot through my skull. My flashlight slipped, and for a split second everything went dark. I felt my lungs tighten as panic flooded me. I fumbled for the flashlight and turned it back on. I realized my hands were shaking. My breath sounded loud in that confined space. I wanted to get out, but I forced myself to look back at the hole. The cold air rushed past my face, and I realized my name was echoing from deeper inside. I saw a faint glint of metal in there, like something was reflecting the flashlight. I couldn't figure out what it was. It seemed to twitch or shift slightly. My stomach rolled. The voice said my name again. I couldn't take it anymore. My instincts screamed for me to leave. I backed out of that cramped tunnel, scraping my elbows against the rough boards. I emerged into the corridor, breathing hard. My shirt was soaked with sweat, but the air felt icy on my skin. That night, I stayed awake in the dining room with the lantern on. I kept a heavy pry bar close by. Every little sound in the house made my heart jump. Around midnight, the voice called me again, but this time, it felt louder. I tensed my muscles and sat on the edge of my cot, shining my flashlight toward the hallway. The whisper died away after a minute, but my nerves were shot. My hands and legs shook. I felt a dull ache building in my neck and shoulders. I wanted to leave right then, but I also felt determined to finish what I started. I told myself that maybe I had knocked something loose in the walls, some old metal fixture that was making noise, but I couldn't explain how it knew my name. The next morning, I tried to focus on more routine work. I removed cracked floorboards near the foyer. I installed new supports under one of the sagging beams. Each time I drove in a nail or hammered something into place, I paused to listen. Sometimes I heard faint scraping in the distance. Sometimes I felt a sudden chill against my skin. I started having trouble concentrating. My hands would slip. My tools felt heavier than usual. I went outside around noon to get some fresh air. The sun felt warm, and the sky looked calm. The contrast with the cold, dark interior of the mansion made me uneasy. I forced myself to go back inside to keep working, but my mind kept drifting to that hidden passage. By the afternoon, I had to see if there was another way to access that space. I went to the second floor, checking the walls near the stairs. The boards were warped and in need of replacement. I used my crowbar to pry off a large section. Behind it, I found another passage that lined up with the one downstairs. I pulled on a flashlight and leaned in. A bitter smell hit my nose, like metal and old dampness combined. The passage looked similar, with insulation and webs everywhere. The temperature felt even colder up there. I crawled a few feet inside before I heard a metallic rattle. I froze and aimed my flashlight ahead. The voice came again, a long, drawn-out whisper. My stomach clenched so hard it hurt. My heart thudded in my chest, and I realized I couldn't keep going. The fear was too strong. I backed out of the passage, panting. I felt dizzy. I decided to seal that opening. I grabbed some plywood and hammered it over the gap. Each strike of the hammer echoed through the hallway. I told myself I'd deal with the structural issues later. Right now, I just wanted to stop whatever was in there from getting closer. My head pounded. Sweat ran down my face. My palms were clammy. With each swing, I found myself glancing over my shoulder as if expecting something to crawl out of the shadows. When I finished, I went downstairs, stepped outside, and took several deep breaths. The late afternoon sun hit me, and it felt good on my skin, but it didn't calm my nerves. I looked back at the mansion. The windows stared back at me like dark eyes. My mind wanted an explanation, some logical reason for what I was experiencing, but I couldn't come up with one. I was sure I heard a voice calling my name. I was sure it came from inside those walls. That night, I stayed in my truck instead of sleeping in the house. I parked a few yards away and left the engine off. The interior of the truck smelled like old coffee and dusty upholstery, but it felt safer than the mansion. As I tried to drift off, I stared through the windshield at the large silhouette of the old building. The moonlight made its edges stand out in a sharp outline. I thought I saw movement in one of the second-story windows, like a brief flicker of light. Then it disappeared. The hair on my arms and neck stood up. My pulse fluttered in my throat. I couldn't sleep well. I woke up dozens of times, each moment expecting to see some shape standing outside the truck. But the night passed without incident, except for the constant hum of my thoughts. In the morning, I forced myself back inside the mansion to continue the renovation. I still had plenty to do. More walls to tear out, new lumber to install, and a plan to strengthen the foundation. But that hidden passage weighed on my mind. Whenever I was alone in a hallway, I felt like the walls were breathing. I couldn't shake the impression that something was just on the other side, waiting. I spent the day working near the back of the house, keeping away from the passages. Every so often, I felt a chill wind pass through the corridor, but there were no open windows or doors. I heard occasional scraping and faint clicks, but the voice stayed silent for most of the day. Late in the afternoon, when I was cleaning up debris, I heard it again. It called my name just once in that same metallic whisper. I dropped my broom and stood still. My heart pounded so loud that it almost drowned out everything else. The whisper was close. I didn't move. My mouth went dry. After a moment, it faded away, leaving me alone in the dim corridor. I'm still here, trying to finish the job. My hands shake sometimes when I pick up a hammer. My flashlight is always close by, and I make sure I have extra batteries. I don't like going into the deeper parts of the house anymore, but I have no choice. Eventually, I need to check the structure in those passages. I need to remove any rotted beams and install new support. But the thought of crawling back in there makes my skin crawl. I can still feel that cold breath on my neck. I still hear the whisper in my head. Every night, I sit in the dining room or sometimes in my truck, thinking about what I've heard and seen. I tell myself it's just old pipes or an odd draft, but I can't fully convince myself. Something in these walls is calling to me. Something is waiting on the other side, and it knows my name. I moved into this new apartment thinking it would be a fresh start. I was excited about the cheap rent, the decent neighborhood, and the fact that I'd finally have a place of my own. The building felt old, though. The walls in the hallway had a stale odor, like air that hadn't been circulated in a long time. I noticed some peeling wallpaper near the stairwell. It didn't bother me much at first. The landlord said the place was fine, and I believed him. The first time I walked down my corridor, I saw a row of old landscape paintings. Each painting looked like it showed some lonely countryside, trees, hills, and foggy roads. They were mounted in these thick brown frames that seemed to belong in a museum. The hallway light was dim, so I couldn't make out many details, but I liked the atmosphere they created. The next morning, I passed by them again and realized they all had a dull, grayish tone. The colors weren't vibrant. The greens of the grass in one painting looked washed out. The sky in another painting seemed more off-white than blue. I remember feeling a slight chill as I walked by. I thought maybe the AC was running too cold, or there was a draft somewhere. During my first night in the apartment, I woke up at around 2 a.m. because I heard a soft clanking noise in the hallway. It sounded like someone gently rattling a doorknob. I got up, put on some sweatpants, and walked to my front door. I opened it carefully and peeked into the corridor. It was dim. The overhead light was flickering. At first, I didn't see anyone, so I took a few steps out. My eyes drifted to the collection of paintings. The frames looked a bit crooked, like someone had nudged them. I noticed one painting in particular, the one closest to my door. It showed a narrow road with leafless trees on either side. In the distance, there was a blurry figure wearing what looked like a dark suit. I couldn't recall seeing that figure before. It seemed odd, but I was half asleep and decided I was just imagining changes in the details. The next day, I examined the paintings more thoroughly before leaving for work. Each day, I started noticing small changes. I realized the images were not as crisp as they seemed on day one. The trees in one painting looked less detailed. The sunlight in another painting had turned pale. The figure in the road painting seemed more defined, like it had come closer to the foreground. I tried to shake off the unease. I told myself it was probably just the lighting, but deep down I felt a knot in my stomach. In the following nights, I heard soft footsteps in the corridor. They never lasted long. It was more like a short shuffle followed by silence. One time, around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like someone sighing or breathing near my door. I turned on the hallway light and looked outside, but everything was still. The paintings were there, quiet and unmoving. I looked at the road painting again. The figure in the background was still there. I felt a clenching sensation in my chest when I realized the figure seemed bigger. It was definitely closer to the foreground than the last time I checked. I spent more time inspecting the frames over the next few days. I noticed that the paint on the trees was fading. It was as if someone had slowly smeared a gray filter on top. The entire painting looked cold, like a colorless winter scene. The figure was now standing in front of a large tree. It had a vague face, but I could tell it was a man in a suit. He appeared stiff, like a statue. My heart pounded every time I walked by. My breathing would become shallow and my eyes would linger on the painting. I worried that if I blinked, he might move again. One evening, I decided to stay in the hallway for a while, just to see if anything changed in real time. I brought out a small stool and sat opposite the paintings, pretending to check something on my phone. The hallway was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent light overhead. I kept glancing at the frames. About 15 minutes in, I realized the figure's arm was in a different position than before. It was subtle, but it looked like he had lifted it slightly. maybe an inch. My pulse hammered in my temples. I got up and walked back into my apartment. I locked the door and tried to calm down. I remember pacing in my living room, feeling sweat form on my forehead. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that figure stepping out of the painting. I had a dream, more like a half-dream, where I heard the frame squeak, like wood twisting. I don't know if I imagined it or if it was real, but I felt a draft in my apartment. When I woke up, I checked the corridor immediately. The figure was now almost at the middle of the painting scene, closer than before. The rest of the painting looked even more washed out. The sky was almost entirely gray. The road looked cracked, and the edges of the frame had flakes of paint peeling off. I started thinking about leaving. I felt uneasy in my own place. I hated the feeling of dread every time I walked down the hallway. But I had just signed the lease and I didn't have the money to break it. I also worried that maybe I was losing my mind. So I decided to try something else. I took a few pictures with my phone, comparing them each day. But when I looked at the photos, they didn't show the same changes. In the phone images, the paintings looked static. The figure was always in the same spot as the first day I noticed it. There was no clarity to the changes I had been seeing with my own eyes. It felt like a trick on my brain. After a week, I noticed more strange noises. Sometimes it sounded like tapping on the wall near the paintings. Other times it sounded like a hushed whisper, like a low wind passing through the corridor. The worst was the feeling of being watched. Whenever I walked to my door, I sensed a presence behind me. If I turned around quickly, I'd only see the paintings. My skin would prickle, and I'd feel my throat tighten. I told a coworker about it one day. I described the old paintings and how I thought they were changing. He laughed it off and said I was letting the stress of a new place get to me. He suggested I hang a different painting over the weird one. I tried that. I took a cheap print of a city skyline and hung it over the painting with the figure. It stayed there for a few hours, but sometime during the night, I heard a thud. I went into the hallway and saw that my print was on the floor. The hook was still nailed firmly into the wall. The old painting was visible again. Nothing else was disturbed. I felt my stomach twist. I hung the print back up and reinforced it with some tape. By morning, it was on the floor again. The figure in the painting was now almost at the front of the frame. The details of his face were still unclear, but I could see he had short hair, a narrow face, and a slight tilt to his head. It looked like he was staring directly outward. I felt shaky every time I passed by. I started hurrying in and out of my apartment, not wanting to be in the hallway any longer than I had to. One night, after I got home from a late shift, I heard a scraping noise in the corridor. It sounded like something heavy dragging across the floor. I stood with my ear to the door, heart pounding. Then I heard a dull thump. I opened the door slightly and peeked outside. The painting's frame looked cracked on the edges. The glass covering another painting was foggy. The corridor smelled damp like wet wood. I didn't see anyone, but I felt an intense chill on my skin. I backed into my apartment and shut the door, turning both locks. My hands shook as I did it. The next morning, I decided I had to inspect the painting closely. The curiosity was too strong. I went out there with a flashlight. The corridor's lighting was still dim, and I wanted to see every detail. I shined the beam onto the painting. The background was almost gone, like white noise on a broken TV screen. The man in the suit was now right in front. He looked pressed against the inside of the glass. His eyes were small, dark spots. There was a faint outline of his hands near the edges of the frame. I felt my heart thudding hard. My breathing got faster. My palms were sweaty and I could feel the hair on my arms stand up. I leaned in closer, almost pressing my face to the glass. The detail was so strange. It felt like he was waiting for something. That night I propped a chair in front of my door and stayed awake as long as I could. I had the idea that if he came out of the painting, I might hear something. Around 2 a.m., I heard a soft click. Then I heard a slow creaking sound like wood bending under pressure. My hands were trembling. My pulse was so loud in my ears that I struggled to hear anything else. I forced myself to stand up and walk to the door. I listened carefully. I thought I heard a faint sliding noise like someone moving across the hallway floor. I gripped the door handle with my sweaty hand. My mind raced with the thought of opening it. I needed to see if he was actually in the corridor, but I felt paralyzed by the idea that he might be right there waiting. My chest felt tight and I couldn't breathe well. I stayed still for maybe 10 minutes, listening. Eventually, I heard a light tapping sound moving away from my door, then silence. When daylight came, I realized I had to check the hallway. I braced myself and opened the door. The paintings were all crooked. The one with the suited figure was empty. It was just a faded background with a few dark smears. My legs felt weak. I looked up and down the hallway. I saw faint footprints on the carpet that led from the painting to somewhere near the stairwell. They were shaped like dress shoes. The prints looked damp, as if someone had just walked through puddles. I followed them for a few steps, but they stopped suddenly. I stood there feeling a cold tension in my spine. My stomach was in knots. I returned to my apartment and locked the door. My body was rigid. I felt short of breath. My mouth was dry and my heart wouldn't slow down. I started gathering my belongings, grabbing random items and stuffing them into a bag. I wanted to leave, but then I thought about whether the figure could follow me somewhere else. I felt a wave of panic. I paced around, checking the windows and corners of my rooms. Nothing was there. I heard a quiet knock on my door around noon. It was a neighbor from the end of the hall. She asked me if I had noticed anything weird last night. She looked nervous. She said she heard heavy footsteps near her door. I told her I'd heard something too, but I didn't go into details. She looked uneasy and said she'd be staying with a friend for a few days. That sealed it for me. I had to get out of here. I didn't know if the landlord would care about my lease. I didn't care either. Before I left, I did one last check of the hallway. The frames were all empty. The images were gone, leaving only blank whitish surfaces. The glass was cloudy. Some parts were cracked. It felt cold, as if there was a draft. I heard a soft sigh from somewhere near the stairwell. I spun around, but no one was there. I headed back to my apartment, grabbed my bag, and walked out. My hands were shaking and my chest felt tight. I avoided looking too closely at anything. I just wanted to reach the elevator and leave. As I walked away, I had a strong sensation that something was behind me. I resisted the urge to turn my head. My back was tense and my skin felt prickly. My heart was pounding in my throat. When I reached the elevator, I pressed the button repeatedly. The door opened, and I stepped inside. I kept my eyes on the hallway until the doors closed. I saw no one, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I left the apartment building that afternoon and never returned. I made arrangements with a friend to crash at his place until I could find somewhere else. I had to hire a mover to get my stuff out a few weeks later. I let them handle everything. I haven't set foot in that hallway since. I don't know if that figure ever came out completely. But when I think back on it, I remember that day I saw the empty frame. I remember the footprints. I think he's out of there now, and I hope he never finds me. I rented this cabin because I wanted quiet nights, a solid desk, and a few weeks to focus on writing my memoirs. From the outside, the place looked normal. It sat on a small piece of land near some trees. The paint on the walls was chipped, and the roof looked like it might need repairs soon. I noticed an old porch swing that squeaked when I pushed it with my foot. I had a set of keys and a suitcase stuffed with notebooks, pens, and a laptop. I was ready to isolate myself and dig deep into my memories. The cabin had a musty smell the first time I stepped in. I kept the door open for a while to air it out. There was a main floor with a living room, a kitchen in the back, and a small bathroom near the stairs. The stairs led to a single bedroom on the second floor. I saw dust in the corners, and the furniture looked old and worn. The floorboards creaked under my boots, but I figured an old cabin in the woods would do that. Nothing seemed out of place during the day. The windows were small, so the place didn't get much light. I turned on every lamp I found, which gave the rooms a soft glow, but it still felt a little dark inside. I set my suitcase next to the bed upstairs. The bed had a faded blue quilt and 2 flat pillows. The closet door was open, and I saw a few empty hangers on a rusted rod. A single dresser sat against the opposite wall. I saw marks on the wood as if someone had scraped something heavy across the surface. I didn't think much of it. I was eager to start working. I wanted to use the desk downstairs, so I walked around until I found it in the corner of the living room. It was a simple wooden desk with a few drawers that stuck when I tried to open them. I forced one drawer open and found a half-burned candle. I didn't see a holder for it. The other drawer was empty except for some dried-up pens. I spent most of that first day cleaning the floor, wiping down surfaces, and making the place feel somewhat comfortable. I heated up a can of soup on the old stove for dinner. The stove made a weird clicking noise when I turned the knobs, but the flame finally lit. I ate in silence at the small kitchen table. I heard the branches outside tapping against the windows when the wind picked up. I felt a slight chill in the air, so I put on a sweater. By nightfall, I was tired from the drive and the cleaning. I shut off the lights, made sure the front door was locked, and climbed the stairs to the bedroom. I heard the wood creak under my steps. It sounded louder than before, probably because it was dark and everything else was quiet. When I reached the top, I felt a strange draft in the hall. The only source of light was a small lamp on the nightstand, which I left on. I got under the covers, pulled the quilt up to my shoulders, and tried to relax. I was thinking about how early I wanted to start writing in the morning. But before I fell asleep, I heard a noise. It was a soft creaking sound on the stairs, like weight shifting on each step. I held my breath. The cabin was old. Maybe the wood was settling. Then I heard it again. A slow creak, then another. It reminded me of the way I had just walked up. I sat up in bed. My heart started pounding. I waited, straining my ears. I thought maybe an animal had gotten inside, or I was just hearing the old steps adjusting after I walked on them. But the noise came in small intervals, like footsteps. I swung my legs out of bed and walked to the door. I twisted the lock to make sure it was secure. Then I put my ear against the wood. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel a pulse in my neck. I heard a faint dragging sound on the floor downstairs. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. Then I saw a dim glow through the gap under the door. It moved back and forth as if someone was walking around with a weak flashlight. I froze. My chest felt tight. I knew no one else was supposed to be here. I hadn't seen any cars or signs of neighbors. I stayed there, pressed against the door for at least a minute. The light kept moving. The dragging sound got closer, then wandered away. My hands started shaking, but I forced myself to stay silent. I didn't want to announce my presence. After a while, the noise stopped and the light disappeared. I waited longer, feeling sweat on my forehead, even though the room was cold. Eventually, I crept back to the bed. I sat there in the dark, too scared to turn off the lamp or close my eyes. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember is the sun shining through the dusty window. I woke up with a stiff neck and a knot in my stomach. I immediately checked the hallway. It was empty. The door was still locked. I went downstairs feeling a little shaky. I looked around the living room and the kitchen. Everything looked normal except for the fact that one of the chairs at the table seemed out of place. I thought I had pushed all of them in the night before, but one was slightly pulled out. I decided to make coffee and try to calm down. I told myself it could have been my imagination or some old wiring causing the light effect. I spent that morning writing. I filled a few pages with notes about my childhood. I tried to ignore the sense of unease. Every time the floor creaked, I jolted in my seat. I kept looking at the stairs. By noon, I needed a break. I went outside for a short walk. The air was cold, and the trees around the cabin looked half dead. I didn't see any other houses nearby. The road was empty. I walked around to the back of the cabin and saw a small pile of firewood against the wall. I thought about lighting a fire in the living room fireplace, but I wanted to avoid any more weird noises. I still needed to figure out what had happened the night before. Maybe there was an animal in the crawl space or some draft that made the light shift under the door. It didn't fully make sense, but I tried to cling to something logical. That second night, I ate dinner in the living room with the lights on. I put a few logs in the fireplace and watched the flames for a while. The smell of burning wood helped me feel grounded. Before heading upstairs, I walked through the cabin, checking every door and every window. I even opened the coat closet and looked behind some boxes. Nothing was there. I went up to the bedroom and locked the door again. I left the lamp on. This time I stayed awake longer. I sat in bed with my laptop open, trying to distract myself with some emails. Around midnight, I heard the first step creak. I recognized the pattern. Step, pause, step, pause. I felt my pulse quicken. My hands felt clammy. The sound continued, reaching the top of the stairs. I could almost picture something standing on the landing. Then came that dragging sound, soft but steady. It seemed to move toward my door. I pressed my ear against it again. My heartbeat thumped in my ears. I saw the same pale light creep underneath. It swayed back and forth as if whoever held it was shifting around. My legs trembled, and I gripped the door handle so tight my knuckles hurt. The dragging sound had a rhythm, like cloth scraping on the floor. I wanted to yank the door open and catch whatever was there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. My chest felt like it was caving in. My breathing was shallow. I stared at the gap under the door. The light moved closer, and I backed away, stumbling over my own feet. The floor felt cold against my soles. I watched that glow for what felt like hours, but it might have been only a few minutes. Then it went dark, and the dragging sound faded. I stayed up until dawn, sitting in a chair that faced the door. I kept the lamp on, waiting for more sounds. In the morning, I was exhausted. I looked around again. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. It made no sense. I felt sure someone or something was walking around at night, but there was no sign of forced entry. I decided to call the owner, but I only got voicemail. I left a short message saying I was hearing noises at night and wanted to know if there was some maintenance schedule or caretaker I should be aware of. I set my phone down and tried to work again. I forced myself to write more. My fingers typed, but my mind kept drifting back to the noises. I wondered if I should leave, but I also felt stubborn. I had driven all the way out here to write, and part of me wanted to figure out what was going on. That afternoon, I checked the stairs carefully. I ran my hand over the steps. They were old and scratched. Some nails stuck out at odd angles. Nothing looked suspicious, though. I peered into the small crawlspace door under the staircase. It was empty except for a few cobwebs. There was a stale smell, but no sign of animals or people. I cleaned the crawlspace just in case something might be hiding there, but I found nothing. I locked the door again and placed a heavy box against it. That night, I decided to wait in the living room with the lights off. I wanted to see if I could catch whoever was messing around. I turned off everything, sat on the couch, and stared at the stairs. I had my phone in my hand, ready to turn on the flashlight. My plan was simple. If I heard the steps creak again, I'd jump up and shine the light right at them. I waited for hours, nearly dozing off. The only sounds were my own breathing and the ticking of an old clock on the mantel. Then I heard the first slow creak. My hand started shaking. The next creak followed. I flicked on the flashlight and pointed it at the stairs. I saw nothing there, only the worn wood and a thin layer of dust. The noise continued. It was close. I forced myself to stand up and move toward the steps. My heart hammered in my chest. I pointed the flashlight around, but I saw no one. Still, the creaking continued as if invisible feet were treading on the wood. I felt a cold sweat drip down my temple. Then I heard that dragging noise behind me near the kitchen. I spun around, shining the light through the doorway. The kitchen table and chairs looked the same. The noise moved closer. My flashlight started flickering. I smacked it a few times and it steadied. Then the noise faded and everything was quiet again. I stood there panting. My mouth was dry. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed on the couch until morning. The next day I saw footprints in the dust on the stairs, but they were too vague to tell if they were mine or someone else's. I examined them carefully. Some prints looked smaller than my boots, though. I felt a tightness in my chest as I realized this. I stepped outside to get some fresh air. The wind blew, rustling the trees. I checked the road again. It was empty. I walked around the cabin, checking the windows from the outside. None were broken or forced open. There was no reason for me to believe a person was sneaking in, yet I couldn't come up with another explanation. By that evening, I was jittery. My hands trembled whenever I reached for something. My stomach felt twisted in knots. I considered leaving, but I also felt drawn to uncover the truth. I had rented this place for a few weeks to write, and I didn't want to back out. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting. Yet the footsteps, the dragging sound, and the faint light felt real. My head started pounding when the sun went down. I ate a quick dinner of canned beans, skipping the stove. I checked the locks one more time. Then I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and wedged it against my bedroom door from the inside. I tested it a few times to make sure it wouldn't budge. I got into bed, fully dressed, with my phone nearby. I left the lamp on again, not caring if I wasted electricity. Around midnight, I heard it. The stairs squeaked one step at a time. My heart raced. I stared at the door. The handle didn't move, but I heard that dragging noise, right outside the room. It scraped the floor, pausing, then scraping again. My throat felt tight. My palms were sweaty. The gap under the door began to glow with that pale light. I saw it shifting. It stopped at one side, then slid across to the other, as if whoever was out there was pacing. I tried to breathe quietly. I gripped the covers. My legs felt weak. Then came a soft thump against the door, not forceful, but enough to make my heart skip. It happened again a moment later, a single tap. I felt the air catch in my lungs. Suddenly the light flickered and vanished. The scraping sound faded away. I stayed awake until dawn again, never moving from the bed. When the first hint of sunlight came through the window, I finally exhaled. My body ached, and my head felt like it was splitting. I removed the chair from the door, opened it slowly, and peered into the hallway. Everything looked the same except for a dark streak on the floor where I heard the scraping. I knelt down and touched it. The surface felt smooth, but I saw a faint line like someone had dragged something heavy or rough across the wood. I stood up and ran my hand through my hair. I needed a real explanation. I needed answers from the owner or someone who knew this cabin's history. I called the owner again, still got no response. At that point, I was ready to leave. I packed my suitcase and carried it downstairs. I set it by the front door, but I paused before locking up. A stubborn part of me wanted to last at least one more night. I don't know why I felt that way. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't running from shadows. Maybe I wanted to catch this intruder, if there was one. I decided to stay one more night. If it happened again, I would leave the next morning. That is where I stood. Tired, on edge, waiting for nightfall, unsure what I would face. I put my suitcase near the door, ready to go at a moment's notice. I sat down at the living room desk and tried to write one more page of my memoirs, but my hand shook so much that my pen scratched lines across the paper. I stared at those lines, frustrated and scared. The cabin felt different now. I could almost feel a presence, but I refused to say it out loud. There were no children here, no caretaker, no friendly neighbor. Just me, this old cabin, and something that came up those stairs every night with a pale light and that awful dragging sound. I stayed put, heart pounding, waiting for whatever was coming next. I first saw the clock when I opened the package from my distant cousin. The wooden case was dark, almost black, and it had detailed carvings around the edges. I felt a slight chill the moment I ran my fingers over the surface. I noticed its brass pendulum inside, hanging from a small hook. It looked heavy. There was a bit of rust around the edges, and some of the engraving on the clock's face had faded. I wasn't sure if it still worked. I didn't even know how to wind it or set the hour. But I decided to place it on a sturdy table near the entrance to my living room. I figured it would be a nice decoration, even if it never chimed. I never expected it to do anything on its own. But on the first night, I had it. Around midnight, I heard a dull, throbbing tone echo from the living room. I was in bed, dozing off, and it pulled me out of a light sleep. At first, I thought my heater had kicked on, or some pipe in the wall made a noise. But it sounded too much like a deep gong to be a pipe. I listened carefully, my eyes scanning the darkness in my bedroom, but I couldn't place it. When I got up to see what happened, I found nothing out of the ordinary. The room was quiet. The clock looked the same as before, with the pendulum still. I shrugged it off and went back to bed. The next morning, I decided to examine the clock again. I opened the glass panel and touched the pendulum. It was cold, and it moved a bit when I nudged it, but it slowed to a stop after a few gentle swings. I tapped the wooden casing, listening for any hidden gears that might be active. It sounded solid. The clock hands hadn't moved at all. They were stuck at about 5 minutes to 6. I assumed the clock was completely broken. I even looked around the back for a place to wind it, but there was no obvious keyhole. I didn't think it was worth taking it to a specialist, so I let it be. That night I tried to go to bed early. I had a long day at work and felt exhausted. My mind drifted in and out of sleep, but at midnight, exactly midnight, I heard that noise again. It was a heavy, low-pitched chime. It seemed to spread through the walls. I sat up in bed, feeling my chest tighten. The hairs on my arms stood up. There was something about the tone that made me uneasy. It wasn't just a mechanical ding. It felt like a vibration that rattled my bones. I forced myself to get out of bed and check the living room again. When I flipped the light switch, the clock looked normal. Its hands were still stuck, and the pendulum was motionless. I stood there for a moment, just listening. My heart was beating fast. I couldn't hear anything else. I frowned, trying to make sense of it. Finally, I went back to bed, convinced that I must have misheard. But that same night, I had a disturbing dream. I saw myself walking through my hallway. It was dark. The only light came from a small lamp on the floor. In my dream, I heard the same deep chime echoing somewhere in the distance. Then I noticed shadows flitting around the corners. They moved fast. I couldn't see any details, just black shapes against the walls. I felt my pulse racing in the dream, like my body was on alert. I tried to speak, but no words came out. I stood there, frozen, as these shadows kept running back and forth, brushing past me. I woke up drenched in sweat. My heart was hammering. I looked at my phone. It was 12:34 a.m. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I got up to check the clock. When I entered the living room, I stopped in my tracks. The pendulum was swinging. It wasn't just a light sway either. It was moving in a steady arc, almost as if someone had wound the clock and set it to run. But I had never wound it. I stood there, my pulse pounding in my ears, watching that pendulum swing back and forth. I considered grabbing it to stop it, but I felt uneasy. My hands trembled, and I felt a pit in my stomach. I let it be. Instead, I stepped backward and went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. I left the lights on and forced myself to sit down until I felt calmer. By morning, the pendulum was still again. I had trouble focusing at work that day. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe the house was uneven, or maybe some draft caused the pendulum to move. But that didn't explain the deep chime at midnight. And it certainly didn't explain why the sound wasn't part of the clock's recorded mechanism, if that mechanism even worked. I thought about taking the clock apart, but I was afraid I'd damage it. Also, I wasn't too eager to mess with it, given how it made me feel. I tried to ignore it. I decided to watch TV until late that evening, hoping I'd be too tired to notice anything strange. But at around 11:50 p.m., I started feeling antsy. I kept glancing at the clock from the couch. It was dark in that corner, but I could see the outline of the wooden case. I found myself counting down the minutes. When midnight arrived, I held my breath. For a few seconds, nothing happened. I let out a sigh, relieved. But then, I heard it again. It was that same low, resonating tone, almost like a distant gong inside my skull. I jumped up from the couch, my heart pounding. I approached the clock and listened closely. There was no mechanical ticking. There was no visible movement from the hands. But that tone lingered for a few seconds, then faded. That night, my dreams were even more intense. I saw my own living room in my dream. The clock was at the center, and the pendulum was moving so quickly it became a blur. I heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy and deliberate, but I couldn't see who or what was causing them. My throat felt tight. I tried to call out, but only a soft gasp came out. Then I saw those shadows again. They crawled along the walls, making faint scratching sounds. I felt my stomach twist. My fingers curled into fists as I tried to steady myself, but my knees felt weak. Suddenly, I noticed the front door was open. A cold draft moved through the room. I felt goosebumps on my arms. One of the shadows darted past me and I felt a jolt of panic. Then I woke up, breathing hard. I sat there in bed, my head spinning. I checked the time on my phone, 12:26 a.m. I stared into the darkness. My mouth felt dry and my shirt was sticking to my back from sweat. I forced myself to get up and look around. Every part of me wanted to ignore the clock, but I had to see what was happening. When I reached the living room, I found the pendulum in motion again. It swung, steady and rhythmic, as if it had been wound. My breath caught in my throat. I turned on the lamp next to the couch and stood there, rubbing my eyes. The rest of the clock was as dead as before. The hands hadn't moved. The worn brass dials were in the same position. But that pendulum was swinging. I reached out and gently held it to stop it. It resisted a little, like there was some momentum pushing it. I felt the weight of it in my palm. The metal felt cold. Finally, it stayed still. I let go, turned around and went back to my bedroom. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Every midnight, the same chime echoed. I would jump out of bed, sometimes with my heart pounding, sometimes in a daze. I'd stumble into the living room, and each time the pendulum was swinging. I started sleeping with my bedroom door shut, hoping to block out the sound. But I could still hear it no matter what. I tried putting earplugs in, but the chime wasn't just audible. It felt like a low rumble in my chest. It was impossible to ignore. The dreams got worse. Each night, I saw more shadows in the house. I heard more footsteps. My vision in those dreams felt oddly clear, but I couldn't see any actual people or shapes, just dark figures flitting around. Sometimes I heard light scratching at the windows. Other times I heard whispers I couldn't make out. Each time I'd wake up feeling disoriented, sweating, my heart racing. And each time the clock's pendulum would be moving. I decided to move the clock to a different room. I picked it up one afternoon, carrying it to a small storage area at the back of my house. It felt heavier than I expected, and the carved edges bit into my hands. I placed it against a wall and covered it with an old sheet. That night I had trouble sleeping, waiting for midnight. When it finally came, I heard the chime just as before. It was muffled, maybe a little softer, but still there. I felt my muscles tense. I kept telling myself it was just a broken clock. But the sound made my skin crawl. I forced myself to check the storage room. The air in there felt stale. I peeled back the sheet and found the pendulum swinging. My heart sank. I reached out, grabbed it, and held it still again. I muttered to myself, asking how this was even happening. I wondered if there was some internal power source I hadn't discovered, but the clock looked purely mechanical, and also very old. Its gears were probably rusted. I had no clue how it was running. I started to feel a dread in my stomach. I couldn't deny that something was off. The nightmares continued. Over time, I slept less and less. Some nights, I'd force myself to stay awake past midnight so I wouldn't be caught off guard by the chime. But that only meant I heard it while I was awake, which was worse. I'd see the clock's glass panel glint in the darkness of the storage room. I'd stand there, breathing hard, waiting for the tone to stop ringing in my ears. When it finally did, I'd go back to bed with my thoughts racing. My chest would feel tight, and sweat would break out on my forehead. I wanted to get rid of the clock, but I also felt compelled to keep it. It was a gift from a distant relative, and I didn't want to just toss it. Part of me was also scared that if I got rid of it, I'd never figure out what was happening. One night, I heard an odd scraping sound near my bedroom door. I jolted awake, my heart pounding. My eyes snapped open. I listened again. It stopped. I waited a minute, then swung my legs over the side of the bed. My hands were shaking a little. I stepped quietly into the hallway, feeling the wooden floor under my feet. It was dark, but I kept the lights off so I could hear better. Everything seemed still. Then I heard the chime. It was exactly midnight. That low tone rolled through the hallway. My stomach lurched. I followed the sound to the storage room. When I opened the door, the smell of stale air hit me. The clock was silent, but the pendulum was in full motion again. I grabbed a flashlight from the shelf and aimed it at the mechanism behind the clock's face. I saw rusted gears, some spider webs, and a few chipped parts. Nothing that looked functional. I couldn't figure out how it was running. I felt a cold sweat along my hairline. I took a deep breath and backed out of the room. During the next few weeks, I reached my limit. My nightmares were constant. Sometimes I felt aches in my body when I woke up, as if I'd been tensed up all night. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. My focus at work got worse. I started snapping at coworkers, and I could tell they thought something was off with me. I told them I was just tired, which was true, but I couldn't explain why. I contemplated hiring someone to come look at the clock, maybe an antiques expert. But I kept putting it off, worried I'd sound crazy. I tried to record the clock at midnight. I set up my phone on a small tripod in the storage room. I aimed it right at the clock and hit record before going to bed. At midnight, I heard the chime as usual. I felt the vibrations in my chest. I clenched my teeth and waited it out. The next morning, I grabbed my phone and played back the video. I saw the clock in the darkness. The screen was a little grainy. The clock's face was barely visible. Then, at exactly midnight, the video glitched for a second. I heard a faint static noise. The next moment, the pendulum appeared to be swinging on camera, but there was no clear chime recorded. I only heard a light buzzing sound. The phone's microphone didn't pick up the deep tone I always heard. I felt my heart drop. I replayed the video again, but it was the same. The chime I heard in real life wasn't there. Yet the pendulum was clearly moving, even though I knew I never wound the mechanism. That scared me more than anything else so far. I couldn't even document the noise. It was like it only existed for me. I started to question my sanity, but the nightmares and the physical feelings seemed too real. My body reacted every time the clock chimed like it was a real sound. I decided I had to do something drastic. One afternoon, I wrapped the clock in thick blankets and moved it into my garage. I locked the door behind me. I hoped that would at least dampen the sound. That night, I still heard it. It was quieter, but it still reached me in my bedroom. At this point, I considered driving it far away and leaving it somewhere. But that felt wrong. I wasn't sure if anyone else would find it, or if it would follow me somehow. I know that sounds ridiculous, but that was how I felt. My palms were always clammy when I thought about the clock. I spent one more week like this. Each day, I grew more exhausted. The nightmares stayed vivid. I saw those shadows in every dream, and I heard them shuffling around my house. Sometimes I woke up with the blankets on the floor like I'd kicked them off in a panic. Other times I felt the weight of dread in my chest, as if I couldn't breathe right. I'd look in the mirror and see the dark circles under my eyes. I barely recognized myself. Late one night, I finally broke down. After the chime woke me up, I stomped to the garage in a rage. My eyes felt red and sore, and I was breathing hard. I threw open the door and turned on the overhead light. The blanket was draped over the clock, but I could see the outline of the pendulum swinging. My stomach churned. My legs shook from tension. I yanked the blanket off and grabbed the clock with both hands. I carried it outside and put it down near my car. The cold night air stung my skin. My breath came out in ragged puffs. I opened the trunk and lifted the clock inside. Then I slammed the trunk shut. My heart was pounding. I was determined to drive somewhere, anywhere, to get this clock out of my life. But as I reached for my car door, I hesitated. My mind spun with 1,000 questions, but mostly I just felt raw fear. I stood there for a minute, trying to decide what to do. I could feel my pulse in my ears. My body felt drained. Finally, I got back in the house and locked the door. I left the clock in the trunk overnight. I didn't sleep much, and I still heard the faint chime at midnight. The next morning, I paced in the kitchen for an hour, drinking coffee, wondering if I should just drive it to some remote place. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Part of me wanted answers. Part of me was scared of what might happen if I abandoned it. That's where I am now. I still have the clock. It's out in my trunk, wrapped in blankets. I can't deny the chime is real to me, and I still have the same nightmares. Every night at midnight, I feel it reverberating through my chest. My body tenses up, and I can't control the fear that washes over me. The shadows in my dreams keep appearing. When I wake up, I feel a nauseating mix of confusion and exhaustion. I don't know how this will end, but I can't forget the look of that swinging pendulum in the dark. I'm stuck with this clock, and I don't know if I'll ever figure out how to stop it. I slammed my foot on the brakes when I saw that figure on the shoulder of the road. It stood there like it had materialized out of thin air, and my headlights carved out its shape against the darkness. There was no movement, no face I could make out, just a tall, motionless form that made my stomach tighten. I froze for a second and gripped the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles felt like they'd pop. Then I forced myself to breathe, pulled to the side, and stepped out into the cold air. I aimed my flashlight at the spot. Nothing. There wasn't a single person around. It was empty, and the quiet was so heavy it pressed against my ears. I got back into the car, but my heart wouldn't slow down. I felt sweat on my neck even though the night air was chilly. I started the engine and continued driving, telling myself it might have been a trick of the light or my tired mind playing games. I'd been driving for hours, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. The road was deserted with only my headlights to show the way. I saw the figure again about 5 minutes later. I almost didn't notice it at first because my eyes were getting blurry from fatigue. Then my heart lurched. It was the same shape, tall and still, right by the edge of the highway. This time I didn't stop. My hands shook and I shifted in my seat, glancing at the figure as I passed. Its head seemed to follow the car, but I couldn't see any detail. No face, no eyes, nothing to identify. Just a dark outline that made my chest feel tight. I decided to keep going. My throat felt dry and I noticed I was breathing fast. My seatbelt felt tighter than it should, like I was trapped in my own car. I turned on the radio to distract myself. Static. I tried a few different stations, but all I got was that faint hiss. I turned it off. I felt too on edge. I wanted to hear if there was any movement outside, if something tapped on my window, or if footsteps approached when I pulled over next. My plan was to keep driving until I reached a gas station or a motel. Then I could rest and shake off this strange feeling. After maybe another 10 miles, my gas gauge started dropping closer to empty than I liked. I had to stop. There was a rest area ahead, a small place with a couple of vending machines and a few parking spots. It was dimly lit by a pair of flickering lights. I pulled in, parked near the closest lamp, and turned off the engine. My hands were trembling on the wheel. The silence in the car was overwhelming. I opened the door and stepped out. The air felt colder than before, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in the last few miles. I looked around. Nobody else was there. I could hear insects buzzing in the grass and the distant hum of a power line, but nothing else. I walked over to a vending machine. The light inside flickered, revealing a small selection of snacks. I slid in some coins and got a bottle of water. My hand was shaking as I reached into the slot to retrieve it. I uncapped it and took a long drink, trying to calm my nerves. Then I heard a shuffle behind me. I spun around, the water bottle still in my hand. I saw a shape at the far end of the rest area, near the bathrooms. It was tall, but I couldn't tell if it was the same figure or just a shadow. My heart pounded and my scalp tingled. I took a step closer, shining my phone's flashlight toward it. The beam of light trembled because my hand was shaking so much. For a moment, I thought I saw a face, but it was gone in the blink of an eye. Only empty air, and the dull concrete wall remained. I turned off the flashlight, deciding not to investigate further. My pulse was too high, and my stomach churned. I threw the empty bottle in a trash can and hurried back to the car. I locked the doors as soon as I got inside. I could still feel eyes on me. I turned the key in the ignition and cranked up the heat. The warm air blew against my face, and I closed my eyes for a moment just to steady myself. Then I backed out of the parking spot and got back on the highway. The next 30 minutes were tense. I kept checking my mirrors. I would see something in the darkness, like a small flicker or a hint of movement, but whenever I focused my eyes, there was nothing there. My shoulders felt rigid, and I kept shifting in my seat to ease the tension in my back. I rolled down the window a bit, letting the cold night air in, hoping it would help me stay awake and alert. I thought about calling someone just to hear another human voice, but my phone had no signal. That wasn't surprising out here in the middle of nowhere. I tossed it on the passenger seat and gripped the wheel again. My breath came in short bursts. I tried to talk myself down. "It's just nerves," I muttered. "You're overreacting. There's nobody out here." But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was like a constant pressure on my back. A sign indicated a small town about 15 miles ahead. I felt a wave of relief. I'd get a room for the night, or maybe find an all-night diner with people around. That was exactly what I needed. Other people. Lights, noise, anything to remind me that I wasn't alone on some forgotten stretch of pavement. I spotted the figure again just before the town's exit. My headlights caught it standing on a patch of gravel next to a broken fence. My chest tightened. It felt like my lungs locked up for a second. My arms went rigid, and I almost veered off the road because my grip on the steering wheel was too stiff. I corrected the car's path at the last second. My eyes flicked to the figure. It stood there as if waiting for me just like before. It didn't wave, didn't move, but I felt it staring. I felt it through the windshield, through the dark, through the beams of my headlights. It was a heavy, suffocating awareness. I sped up, pressing the gas pedal harder than I intended. My heart rattled in my chest. I wanted to shout at it, but what good would that do? The car roared as I shot forward, and the figure disappeared from my side mirror. My breathing didn't calm until I saw the faint lights of the town up ahead. I turned onto a main street with a few scattered buildings. Most were dark, but I noticed a small motel with a neon sign that flickered. I pulled into the parking lot. It was old, with cracked asphalt and a single street lamp that cast a weak glow over the cars. I parked near the lobby entrance and killed the engine. I hesitated before getting out, scanning the lot for anything unusual. I didn't see anything, so I stepped out and locked the car. The motel office was lit by a single lamp on the counter. A tired-looking man in a worn shirt sat behind the desk, flipping through a magazine. I approached and asked for a room. He handed me a form to fill out and gave me a key. He mumbled something about checkout times and Wi-Fi passwords, but I wasn't paying close attention. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the glass door. No sign of that figure. I thanked him and found my room, which was on the ground floor near the back of the motel. I walked in, closed the door, and dropped my bag on the chair. The room smelled like old carpet and stale air. I flipped on the lights, turned the deadbolt, and let out a long breath. My stomach growled. I realized I hadn't eaten much, but I didn't feel like going out. I wanted to stay locked in, safe from whatever was out there. I checked the bathroom. The fluorescent light buzzed, but the place was clean enough. I let the water run for a moment and splashed some on my face. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot and my skin looked pale. I felt a twinge of embarrassment. Here I was, a grown man, spooked by a shadow, but my gut told me it was more than a shadow. I went back into the room and turned on the TV for background noise. The signal was weak, but I found a channel playing late-night reruns. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to let my muscles relax. My legs felt tight, and my hands were still shaking. Every few minutes I checked the curtains to make sure there was nobody outside the window. I couldn't help myself. My heart pounded every time I pulled the curtain aside. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I laid down on the bed fully clothed. I was halfway between waking and sleeping when I heard a soft tap on the window. My eyelids flew open. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. The TV was on mute, but the faint flicker lit the room in flashes. I held my breath and listened. The wind outside whistled and the motel sign buzzed, but I didn't hear another tap. Maybe it was just a branch hitting the glass or a piece of debris blowing around. I stayed still for several minutes, my ears straining for any sound. My throat felt scratchy and my forehead was damp with sweat. The tap didn't come again. I glanced at the time on my phone, 3:12 a.m. I wanted to sleep, but every nerve in my body was on alert. Finally, I decided to peek outside. I moved slowly toward the window, keeping the lights off. I cracked the curtain a tiny bit and looked out. At first, I saw only the empty parking lot. Then my eyes adjusted to the low light. Next to the street lamp, I spotted it. That shape. It was standing under the weak glow, perfectly still. I couldn't see a face or any features, but it was definitely that same figure I'd seen on the road. I gasped and dropped the curtain. My skin felt cold. I stumbled back and sat on the bed. My pulse hammered in my ears. I couldn't believe it had followed me here. I felt cornered. I considered calling the front desk, but what would I say? Some tall shape was standing in the parking lot. It hadn't done anything illegal. It hadn't broken in. I thought about calling the police, but then I imagined how that conversation would go. Would they even take me seriously? I sat there trying to calm down. I told myself to think straight. If it was a person, they might be messing with me. Or maybe it was just my exhausted mind turning random shadows into a sinister figure. But I'd seen it multiple times now, always in the same posture, like it was watching. I wanted to leave the motel and drive until morning, but I felt too tired. The idea of going back out into the night, alone on that deserted highway, made my chest tighten. Staying put seemed safer. At least here I had walls, a lock, and maybe some other guests nearby. Even the front desk clerk was some sort of backup. I decided to wait it out. I turned up the volume on the TV to fill the silence. I pulled out a chair and propped it against the doorknob. Then I sat at the edge of the bed facing the window. I could see the silhouette of the parking lot lamp through the curtains. My heart pounded in my rib cage, but I kept my eyes open, determined not to drift off. Minutes dragged by. I heard the wind outside and the occasional sound of a car passing on the road. My neck felt stiff, and my eyes burned from staring so hard. I didn't see the figure anymore, but I kept replaying the moment I spotted it under the light. Its posture was so rigid, like it was carved out of the night itself. I must have dozed off somehow because I jerked awake to the sound of my own snore. The TV showed a static screen. My phone said 5:21 a.m. I panicked and rushed to the window. The faint glow of dawn lit the sky, and the parking lot was empty. I stood there watching as the day slowly pushed the night away. My body felt heavy and my thoughts were slow. I rubbed my eyes and dropped into the chair. Maybe it was gone now. I told myself I'd just get the hell out of there as soon as the sun was fully up. I felt safer in daylight, and I assumed normal traffic would start flowing. Being surrounded by other cars might help me feel less isolated. Around 7 a.m., I returned the key at the front desk. The clerk eyed me like I looked half dead. I didn't say much. I just wanted to be gone. I walked outside, squinting in the morning light. The motel parking lot looked different in the day. Less threatening, but still shabby and lonely. I loaded my stuff into the trunk, slid into the driver's seat, and turned on the ignition. My entire body was aching. I pulled out onto the main street, heading west. I kept checking the rearview mirror for any sign of that figure. All I saw were a few regular people going about their morning routines. I passed a diner with a couple of cars out front, a grocery store with a nearly empty parking lot, and then I reached the highway entrance. Traffic was a bit heavier now, but still not bad. At least I wasn't the only car on the road. I glanced at my gas gauge. Good enough to go another hour or two before needing to stop. I tried to relax my shoulders and enjoy the warmth of the rising sun. But every time I slowed down, I felt a spike of anxiety. I half expected to see that dark shape on the roadside again, waiting for me. I forced my eyes to stay on the road. Eventually, I found a rest stop with a few cars parked outside. I decided to pull in for a quick break. As soon as I parked, my heart rate went up. I scanned every corner of the small lot. Nothing unusual. I stepped out of the car and stretched. The air was crisp, but at least it wasn't as cold and unsettling as last night. I walked inside the rest stop. It had a convenience store with coffee and pastries. I grabbed a cup of coffee, paid, and sat at a table in the corner facing the door. My arms felt tense, and I kept my ears open for any strange sounds. People came and went. They looked normal: families, truckers, road trippers. I took small sips of coffee and tried to calm down. My breathing was still uneven. My nerves felt stretched thin. After finishing my coffee, I tossed the cup and walked back to the car. I took one more cautious look around before getting in. Then I drove off, continuing toward my final destination. But deep down, I knew I wasn't calm. The memory of that figure, tall, silent, and unrelenting, sat in my head like a constant ache. Every time I glanced at an empty stretch of road, I imagined it appearing in my headlights again. I still haven't reached the end of my journey. Every time I park, I feel that same chill in the air. Every time I glance at a lonely bend in the road, I remember how it was waiting for me, standing completely still, as if it knew exactly where I would be. I haven't seen it in daylight, but that doesn't ease my nerves. Even now, I feel like it's close, watching from a hidden spot I can't quite see. I'm afraid to keep driving, but stopping doesn't help. I feel its presence whenever I stop. The only thing that keeps me going is the hope that at some point I'll lose it, or maybe I'll reach somewhere populated enough that it can't follow me anymore. Until then, I'm on edge, checking every mirror, every window, and every shadow on the side of the road. And I keep telling myself to stay alert because that shape could be waiting anywhere, watching me with an unseen gaze that makes my skin crawl. I haven't found a way to shake it yet, and I don't know how long I can last without sleep, but as of now, that's my reality. I just keep driving. Something is wrong with my arm. I first noticed it when I got home from the dig. I sat on my couch, scratching at an itch near my elbow, and felt this thin, raised line. It wasn't a cut or a normal scar. It felt like a sealed seam under my skin. That caught my attention, but I was too exhausted to worry about it right away. I had spent weeks crawling through dust and debris, documenting every bit of pottery and stone at the site. I figured it was some irritated patch of skin or an insect bite I hadn't noticed before. Then the first night came. At midnight, I woke up with a burning sensation. The mark glowed in the dark, like an ember under my flesh. I jumped out of bed, drenched in sweat. My arm throbbed, and there was this pressure in my chest that made me gasp for air. That was the moment I realized this wasn't some normal injury. When I got up that night, I could barely stand still. My bedroom felt too small, and I kept pacing around. I flipped the light switch, but it only made the glow more obvious. The mark had a dull red color, and it pulsed with each beat of my heart. I splashed water on my arm, hoping the coolness might help. The water slid off without making any difference. My skin felt hot under my fingers, but the area around the mark looked normal, aside from the raised outline. I tried not to panic, but my breath was unsteady. I kept telling myself I had an infection or an allergic reaction, but that didn't explain the glow or the sudden terror that churned in my stomach. I went to the bathroom and searched my medicine cabinet for anything I could use. Antibacterial cream, painkillers, bandages. None of it helped. I felt a pressure in my head, like something was pushing from inside my skull. Then I heard this faint voice. It was barely a whisper, but it was there. It said, "Return to the site. Release what was sealed. I froze. The voice sounded close, but it wasn't in the room. It was in my head. I clutched the edge of the sink, waiting for it to stop. Eventually, it faded into a light static in my mind, leaving me trembling. By the next morning, the glow was gone. The mark looked like a normal scar, a thin line with a slightly raised surface. It didn't hurt. I felt a bit silly standing there in my bathroom, staring at my arm. I tried to convince myself it was all some weird dream, but my heart rate jumped every time I recalled the voice. I tried to brush it aside. I went about my normal routine. Coffee, a shower, then a quick look at my notes from the dig. We had found a chamber with strange symbols carved into the walls. I remembered them well because I had spent a full day tracing them onto paper. I had planned to decode them with a colleague, but we never got around to it. For a moment I wondered if there was a connection. Then I stopped myself. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. That afternoon, I ran errands. I went to the grocery store and the post office. Everything felt heavier than usual. My chest tightened when I heard echoes of that voice in my head, but it didn't form words this time. It was just a murmur that came and went. I tried to distract myself by checking my phone, listening to some messages and scrolling through photos I took on the dig. There were images of pottery shards, stone carvings, and the interior of that hidden chamber. One picture showed a faint carving on the floor. I squinted at it on my phone. It looked a bit like a circle with lines crossing through it. I turned off my phone and drove home. That evening, I made a decision. I was going to ignore the weirdness and see if the mark acted up again at midnight. Maybe it was a one-time thing. I tried to stay up, watching some random show on TV to keep my mind occupied. Around 11:30 p.m., my arm started to itch. I pulled up my sleeve and saw the mark had become more pronounced. The edges were sharper and I could feel a tingling sensation around it. My stomach knotted. At midnight, the glow returned. I stood in my living room, lights off, arms shining in the dark. My heart pounded and I felt a wave of nausea. Then the voice came back. Release what was sealed. Free it. The words echoed in my head, as if someone stood right behind me, speaking directly into my ears. I clenched my fists and tried to block it out, but it kept going. You must return. It's waiting. I couldn't sleep. The pain ran up my shoulder and into the base of my skull, and I started getting a headache. The voice wouldn't stop. I ended up pacing back and forth, stepping on the same floorboards until I wore myself out. Around 3 a.m., the glow faded, and I collapsed on my couch. I slept for maybe 3 hours. I woke up feeling like I had run a marathon. My legs were shaky and my forehead was damp with sweat. The mark looked normal again, but I had no energy left to pretend it was a random ailment. I decided to call my friend Mark, a fellow archaeologist. I wanted to see if he had any weird experiences after the expedition. Maybe he had something similar, but he just said he was fine. No nightmares, no glowing scars. He teased me about working too hard and said I should get some rest. I knew that wouldn't solve anything. By the third night, the pain was worse. I felt needles crawling under my skin. My arm burned and I couldn't hold back my groans. The voice pushed harder, repeating the same lines. Go back. Release it. My chest felt tight and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My palms were clammy and I kept swallowing to keep my mouth from drying out. I took a moment to drink water, but I almost choked because my hands were shaking. By dawn, I made a decision. I was going to go back to that site, even if I wasn't sure why. I needed answers. Maybe I had brushed up against something toxic. Maybe there was a fungus or a parasite in that underground chamber. I wasn't sure, but I had to find out. The next morning, I threw some clothes and supplies into my backpack. I packed a flashlight, some bottled water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a short crowbar. I didn't know what I might need, but the crowbar felt safer than going empty-handed. It was about a 6-hour drive back to the remote region where we had set up camp. The road was dusty, and there were long stretches of nothing but dried bushes and rocks. My mind wandered to the voice every time I felt the mark itch. I gripped the steering wheel harder, trying to keep my focus on the road. I played loud music to drown out any stray thoughts. When I arrived at the site, It looked abandoned. Our tents were gone, and the small portable lab was dismantled. The main digging area was empty. Only a few crates and broken tools lay scattered around. I parked my car near the chain-link fence we had installed for security. The place was quiet except for the wind. I got out and felt a chill even though the sun was still high. My arm tingled again, but it wasn't glowing yet. I walked toward the main entrance of the chamber. We had found a stone doorway that led underground, and it took weeks to clear the debris that blocked it. Inside, the air was stagnant. My flashlight cut through a thin layer of dust in the air. The corridor walls had carvings of unfamiliar symbols. I stepped carefully, remembering the uneven floor. My boots crunched on loose pebbles. My heart pounded with each step. I made my way to the main chamber, the place where we had discovered that circle carved into the floor. My shoes scraped against the stone, and I could hear my breathing echo. I stopped in front of the circle. The lines intersected in an odd pattern, but I couldn't recall the exact meaning. My arm started to burn. I winced as the mark began to glow again, even though it wasn't midnight yet. A soft hum buzzed in my ears. The voice was there, but it was quieter. It urged me to do something, but I wasn't sure what. I crouched down to inspect the carving. My mark flared, and I gasped. The circle on the floor looked more pronounced than before, as if the lines had been cut deeper. I saw fine cracks running through the stone, forming a kind of opening. I rubbed the sweat from my forehead. The voice in my head pushed me to place my hand on the carving. I hesitated, but the burning in my arm intensified. I pressed my palm against the center of the circle. The stone was warm to the touch. I felt a slight vibration. A grinding sound echoed as the cracks in the floor spread. I stepped back. My pulse raced. The stone in the center loosened and tilted. There was a narrow gap beneath it. Without thinking too much, I used my crowbar to pry it open. The slab shifted and a stale odor rose from below. My heart pounded. I leaned forward, shining my flashlight into the hole. There were stone steps leading down. My mark burned even stronger, forcing me to breathe in short, shallow bursts. The voice urged me forward, but I felt my knees shaking. I wiped my mouth, trying to keep myself under control. Then I took the first step. I lowered myself into a small chamber. It wasn't tall, so I had to crouch. The walls were damp, and my flashlight revealed thick layers of dust clinging to every surface. In the corner, there was a stone container with a sealed lid. My voice caught in my throat. The container was about the size of a large trunk, with chipped corners. My arm burned, and the voice repeated the same phrase. Release it. My hand shook as I brought the crowbar to the container's edge. My stomach churned. I pried at the lid. It took some effort. The seal cracked with a dull snap, and the lid shifted to the side. A musty smell hit my nose. Inside, there was a dark mass wrapped in old cloth. No inscriptions, no jewels, no decorative art. Just a bundle covered in layers of ancient fabric. I pulled at the cloth, unwrapping it bit by bit. My flashlight revealed a stone object inside. It was shaped like a thick cylinder with markings carved around it. The surface was rough, and it looked like it might crumble if I handled it too roughly. The voice in my head quieted. The burning in my arm reduced to a dull ache. I lifted the cylinder. It was heavier than it looked. I set it on the floor and bent down to inspect the carvings. They had the same pattern as the mark on my arm. I traced a finger over it, and I felt a slight vibration in my arm. I swallowed hard. My breathing was labored. I felt like my lungs weren't filling enough. The cylinder's surface felt warm, as if it was alive. My thoughts raced. I didn't know what to do next. All I could hear was my heartbeat and the faint sound of wind blowing above ground. I stood up, holding the cylinder at my side, not sure if I should take it or leave it. The voice had told me to release it, but it wasn't giving me more instructions. Sweat dripped down my temples and my arm still ached. I looked at the object and then at the stairs leading up. I eventually decided to carry it out. I needed to see if removing it would stop these nightly attacks. I climbed the steps slowly. My legs felt stiff, and my back was sore from crouching. When I reached the main chamber, I laid the cylinder on the ground and sat down next to it. The mark on my arm still glowed, but it wasn't as bright as before. I stared at the cylinder, expecting something to happen. Nothing changed. I heard my own breathing, harsh in the quiet space. After a few minutes, I picked up the cylinder again and made my way out of the chamber, back into the open air. The sunlight stung my eyes. I walked to my car, looking around to see if anyone else was there, but I was alone. I placed the cylinder carefully in the back seat. My arm twitched and I gritted my teeth. I felt tired and uneasy, but not as terrified as before. Before leaving the site, I took one more look at the entrance. I felt like something was watching me from inside. I couldn't see anything, but my heart rate spiked. The tension in my head grew again, but I forced myself to keep walking. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. Then I drove away, leaving the abandoned camp behind. On the drive back, I kept glancing at the cylinder. My mark stayed visible but didn't burn as much. The voice was silent. I took a few sips of water and tried to steady my nerves. I still felt a hint of fear in my chest, but the pain had dulled. I had no clue what I was supposed to do with this object. All I knew was that the voice said to free what was sealed, and I had removed it from that chamber. Now, I'm waiting to see if the mark will stop glowing at night, or if I made things worse. I'm telling you this because I don't know what else to do. My arm still has that mark. It's not swollen or infected, but it's there. It's real, and it glows. I have this cylinder in my trunk, wrapped in a tarp. I haven't looked at it since I got back. Part of me wants to throw it into a deep hole and forget it, but I'm afraid that might trigger something worse. For now, I'm just trying to stay calm. I'm breathing in and out, keeping my eyes on the clock as midnight approaches. My arm starts to itch a little around that time, and I feel that old tension building behind my eyes. I don't know what's going to happen tonight. Maybe the voice will return. Maybe the burning will flare up again. Or maybe it'll stay quiet. I'm preparing some basic notes in case I need to tell someone else about this. I haven't told Mark or anyone else about the object. I figure they'd think I'm losing my mind. Sometimes I wonder if I am. But the pain feels real. The glow is real. And that voice, I can't just dismiss it as a dream. I lived through those nights, and I still have the aches in my bones to prove it. That's all I can say for now. I'm holding onto the cylinder and hoping I haven't unlocked something dangerous. My plan is to watch my arm tonight, see if the glow returns, and then decide what to do next. This isn't a decision I can make lightly, but I'm out of options. I can't ignore the voice and I can't ignore what happened in that chamber. I just wish I knew what I unleashed. For now, I'm stuck with this mark, that cylinder, and the possibility that I've only started something much bigger. I moved into this house 3 weeks ago. I didn't notice anything odd at first. The place seemed normal. The living room had a couch and a worn-out recliner that the previous owner left behind. The kitchen had outdated cabinets and a leaky faucet. The bedrooms upstairs were empty, so I filled them with boxes and old furniture. Then I discovered the attic. There's a small door at the end of the upstairs hallway that leads to a narrow staircase. It goes up to a low ceiling space where dust coats the floor. A single light bulb hangs from the rafters. It's a cramped area, and I can't stand upright in most places. There's a round window on the far side of the attic, facing the backyard. It's about the width of a tire. It's covered in dust, and there's no latch on the inside. I didn't think much of it. But on my first night here, I noticed something strange. I remember lying in bed and hearing a faint tapping noise. I ignored it at first, but it kept coming in short bursts. I sat up and listened. It sounded like it was coming from the attic. I assumed it might be pipes or some loose board. I tried to go back to sleep. The next morning I found some odd prints on the attic's window. They looked like finger marks, but I figured it might have been my own smudges from when I was wiping it the day before. I didn't clean them off. I just left them because the dust in the attic was thick, and I had no immediate plans to tidy the place. That afternoon, I climbed up again to take another look. The prints were still there. There were 4 or 5 distinct impressions, like someone pressed their fingertips against the glass. I ran my palm over them. They felt smooth, like fresh smudges, but I didn't recall leaning against that part of the window. Still, I shrugged it off. That night, I lay in bed thinking about it, but I eventually fell asleep without hearing anything unusual. On the 3rd night, I woke up to a faint glow coming from the ceiling. I looked at the small line of light that formed near the attic door. I got out of bed and walked to the hallway. At the top of the attic steps, everything was dark, so I reached for the pull chain on the light bulb. When I turned it on, the place looked the same as always. Boxes, dust, and that round window. I walked over to the window. I noticed a pale bluish glow, but it was fading away. I couldn't tell if it was just the moonlight passing through some nearby trees. I looked outside, saw nothing but my backyard, and that was it. I went back down, feeling a little uneasy. I told myself it was probably nothing. 3 days passed. I started getting busier with work. I had to set up my home office in one of the upstairs bedrooms. Every day around noon, I took a break and went up to the attic to toss out trash or move boxes around. Each time I saw more prints on the dusty window. Once there were sets of prints in 2 spots, like 2 hands had been placed there. I didn't remember touching it like that. Another time, the prints appeared to circle the rim of the glass. I thought maybe I did that accidentally while opening a box nearby, but I wasn't sure. On the 5th night, I was up late doing some paperwork. At around midnight, I noticed a weird flickering light reflection on the hallway wall. It came and went every few seconds. My heart started pounding. I got up and walked quietly to the attic door. It was closed, but light flickered around the edges of the frame. I considered calling the police, but I wasn't sure what I'd say. Instead, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and headed up. When I opened the attic door, everything went dark. I flicked the attic light switch and the single bulb lit up the space. The round window wasn't glowing anymore. I walked over to it and peered outside. There was a slight breeze rustling the trees. I stood there for a moment, feeling sweat gather on my forehead. The attic felt stuffy even though it was a cool night. I tapped the glass and it felt solid. Then I saw the fresh prints again. They were right where my eyes rested, at face level. 5 distinct fingertip marks. They looked smaller than my own hand. I raised my hand to compare. My fingers were bigger. That realization sent a shiver through my arms. I pulled my hand away and went back downstairs, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. For the next few days, I kept my distance from the attic. I worked, cooked meals, and tried to adjust to living alone in this house. At night, I sometimes heard creaking noises, but I blamed the old structure. The house was built over 70 years ago. Wood shrinks and expands, that's what I told myself. Then on the 8th night, I saw the light again. It was around 1 a.m., and I was in the living room watching TV. The overhead light was off, and the only illumination was from the screen. In the reflection on the dark TV, I caught a flicker of blue on the ceiling behind me. I turned around. The hallway upstairs glowed faintly with that same pale color. My breath caught in my throat. I stood up, knees feeling weak. I approached the attic steps slowly. The floorboards creaked under my socks. My heart thudded so hard I felt a slight pressure in my chest. I nudged the attic door open and lifted my flashlight. The gloom seemed thicker than usual. The bulb overhead was off. The round window glowed with that soft blue color. It wasn't bright. It was more like a dim flicker. I couldn't see a source for it. I pointed my flashlight toward the glass. Right then, the glow vanished. It just went dark. I felt a chill move down my neck and into my spine. I hurried to the window, slapped my hand against it, and pressed my face to the glass. Nothing, just my empty backyard. I flicked the flashlight off and stood there in the quiet attic. The silence was almost suffocating. Then I noticed new marks in the dust on the windowsill, like someone rested their hands there, facing inward, watching me. I stepped back, almost tripping over a box. I stumbled against a wooden beam, banging my shoulder. My heartbeat felt erratic. My hands were shaky and the attic air felt thick in my throat. I turned and rushed downstairs. I locked the attic door and put a chair under the handle. I went to my bedroom, closed the door, and stayed awake until sunrise. My mind kept playing over those prints. They were pointed inside, like someone stood on the outside ledge or was leaning in through the window. But there's no ledge out there. There's nothing to stand on. The next morning, I called a friend who lived in the next town. I told him there was something odd happening in my attic. He laughed it off, said it was probably my imagination. I invited him over, but he couldn't make it that day. So I went up there by myself in the daylight. I forced myself to walk right over to the window. The dust was disturbed again. It looked like someone had smeared it in broad swipes, but I couldn't see any coherent shapes. I tried opening the window, but it was stuck. I pushed and pulled, but it didn't budge. There was no lock on this side, so maybe it was painted shut or sealed from the outside. I made up my mind to hire someone to pry it open or replace it. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with all the lights on in the house. I had a small baseball bat next to me, and my phone ready to dial 911 if I saw anything suspicious. My stomach felt tight, and my back muscles ached from tension. Around midnight, I noticed the upstairs hallway lights flickering. I got up, walked over, and saw that the attic door was slightly ajar. I felt a rush of adrenaline. I gripped the bat and called out, "Who's there?" No answer. I crept up the stairs. The door was open about an inch. I put my hand on it and pushed. The attic was dark. I reached for the pull chain on the bulb. It clicked on. I scanned the area. Nobody was there. The window looked the same. Dusty, closed. I took a step closer. Then the bulb flickered and went out. Total darkness swallowed me. I fumbled for my flashlight, which was on my belt loop. I turned it on and pointed it at the window. The bluish glow lit up. It shone from behind the glass, pulsing slightly. I felt my breathing catch. My chest tightened. I clutched the bat in my left hand. I wanted to smash the window, but my hand shook too much. Slowly, I inched forward, shining my light on the edges of the frame. The dust around the window started to swirl in the beam, as if someone brushed past it. Then I saw fresh finger marks forming in the dust, right in front of my eyes, as if an invisible hand was pressing down. My scalp tingled, and sweat ran down the back of my neck. My heart pounded so hard that it felt like it echoed in my ears. I didn't want to stand there anymore. I backed away and made it to the stairs. Then the attic door slammed shut on its own. The noise echoed. I almost dropped the flashlight. I gripped the doorknob and turned it, but it wouldn't open. I yanked and rattled the knob. It stayed stuck. I started to panic. I raised the bat and smashed it against the door near the handle again and again. On the third strike, the wood cracked. I kicked it and the door flew open. I stumbled out into the hallway and fell to my knees, panting. When I turned around, I saw no one behind me. The attic was still. The window was dark again. I rushed downstairs, threw on my coat, and went outside. I circled around to the back of the house to see if I could find any sign of tampering on the attic window from the outside. There's a steep roof that angles toward the backyard. I shined my flashlight upward. The round window was about 10 feet above the edge of the roof. There's no gutter or ledge, nothing that anyone could stand on. I tried to see if there were footprints or marks on the siding. Nothing. The night air felt damp and cold. My breath came out in short puffs. I felt like I was being watched, but I didn't see anyone outside. After a few minutes, I went back in. That night, I barely slept. I left the light on in my bedroom and set an alarm to wake me every hour. Each time I looked at the attic door, it stayed shut. In the morning, I called a handyman to come check the attic window. He couldn't come until the weekend, so I stayed away from that area during the day. I told myself it was better to keep it closed off until a professional looked at it. But that evening, I heard 3 sharp knocks on the attic door. They sounded precise and deliberate. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, my legs feeling like they were made of stone. I waited. Nothing else happened. I decided not to go up there. At around 11 p.m., I heard a faint tapping from above, like someone drumming their nails on glass. My mouth felt dry. My fingers trembled. I grabbed the baseball bat again. I walked up the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the door, I pressed my ear to it. I heard a rhythmic tapping sound. I opened the door quickly. The light was off again. My flashlight beam caught a glimpse of that bluish glow behind the window. As soon as I stepped inside, the glow disappeared. I saw that the dust on the floor had footprints, but I couldn't make out a shoe size or pattern. It just looked smudged, as if multiple steps overlapped. My flashlight flickered. I smacked it against my palm. It steadied. I scanned the area. Empty. I felt the back of my neck prickle, like a sudden static jolt. Then the window rattled. I froze. The glass vibrated for a moment, then stopped. I took a few steps closer and reached out to the window with my free hand. My fingers touched cold glass. Through that thin barrier, everything outside looked normal. No figure, no shape, just darkness. But the dust on my side looked like it had been pushed from the outside in, leaving streaks that led toward the center of the attic. It was as if something had pressed through the glass without breaking it. I felt nauseous. My stomach churned, and a wave of heat rushed to my head. I staggered back and left the attic. Now, I live with that tension every single night. I hear soft scraping on the window, like fingernails on a chalkboard. Sometimes I see the hallway light flicker, and I know the faint blue glow is in the attic, waiting for me to come up. Every time I check, the glow fades, and I find new marks or smudges. I never see a person. I never catch any shape or face. There are just these suggestions that someone or something stands there looking in or looking out. The prints don't match mine. They don't look large enough to be mine. And they always appear in positions I wouldn't place my hands in. I keep telling myself I'll move out if it gets worse. But for now, I haven't left. I try to keep my routine normal. I work, eat, watch TV, and lock the attic door at night. Every morning I inspect it. Sometimes I find it unlocked. Other times it's still locked but open by an inch. I can't figure out how it happens. I've taped it shut. I've even nailed it shut once, but the nails ended up on the floor the next day. I asked my friend to come over and stay the night, but he hasn't been able to. So I'm alone with this situation. Tonight I'm writing this down in my living room. The TV is on mute. My ears are alert to every small noise. I keep glancing at the staircase. The house is silent right now, but I have this sense that something is waiting for the right moment. My body feels tense, like I'm ready to spring up and check at any second. My nerves feel shot, but I'm still here, listening for that faint tapping or that momentary flash of blue light. It's not showing itself yet. Maybe it's waiting, like always. I have no answers for what's happening with that window. During the day, it looks like a normal round window covered in dust. At night, it comes alive with that cold glow. It never stays long enough for me to figure out the source. All I know is that whenever I try to see it up close, it disappears. And each time I see fresh evidence that something's been there, pressing its hands against the glass. I don't know what it wants or why it waits for me, but I feel it. I sense it through the walls and the silence of this old house. Every night, the footsteps, the tapping, the flickering light, and the prints in the dust remind me that I'm never really alone here. I'm just waiting, and it's waiting with me on the other side of that round window, looking in. I can still hear the bell sometimes, even when I'm in my living room with the curtains drawn and the lights off. It's a low, heavy ring that doesn't sound like any bell I've heard before. It comes at odd hours. Sometimes it's just after midnight. Sometimes it's closer to dawn. Every time I hear it, I feel my stomach twist and my pulse jump. My hands tense up and I can't focus on anything else. I live alone, so there's nobody here to confirm that it's real. But I know it's not my imagination. That old bell tower stands by itself in the middle of my neighborhood, surrounded by nothing but weeds and a cracked sidewalk. There's no door, no stairs, and no reason for any bell to ring. I've lived in this neighborhood for a few years. I moved here because the rent was cheap and I liked how quiet it was at night. The bell tower never bothered me during the first few months because I didn't think it worked anymore. People around here told me it was part of a church that got demolished decades ago. They left the bell tower standing, but nobody ever touched it. I figured it was too old to ring. Then one night, about a year ago, I heard it for the first time. I was brushing my teeth when I felt the mirror shaking. It was almost like a low vibration that made my jaw clench. Then I heard a single, loud gong. I spit out the toothpaste and listened. Another gong came, then another. I walked to the window and saw the tower's silhouette against the sky. It was just there, dark and imposing. I couldn't see any light, any movement, nothing. But the ringing continued for a few seconds. Then it stopped. I tried to tell myself it was the wind or a random piece of metal clanging somewhere. I convinced myself it was a coincidence. But it happened again the next night, then again a few days later. It wasn't every single night, but it happened often enough that I started looking out the window whenever I heard that sound. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see for myself what was going on. So one night, after I heard the first gong, I grabbed my jacket and walked outside. The air was chilly and my breath felt tight in my throat. The street was empty. The glow from the streetlights made everything look washed out. The bell tower was a few blocks away, so I followed the echo of the bell. My hands were shaking. Every time the bell rang, I felt like my chest was tightening, like I was being pulled toward it. I reached the base of the tower in about 5 minutes. There's a small chain-link fence around it that's half rusted away, but I noticed nobody had replaced it in years. The gate was just hanging there, off one hinge. I pushed it, and it made a sharp squeak. I stepped through and approached the tower. It's tall, maybe 3 stories high. The bricks are old and cracked, but they're thick. I had a flashlight with me, and when I shined it on the walls, I noticed strange marks and faded letters. They weren't in any language I recognized. Some were upside down or maybe just scrawled in a strange way. It looked like someone had painted lines and shapes there a long time ago, and they'd mostly worn away. In a few spots I could see what looked like letters, but they were so faint that I couldn't make them out. The bell rang again. The sound was so close that I felt a pulse in my eardrums. It made me stumble back a step. I aimed the flashlight up, but I couldn't see the bell itself from the outside. The opening at the top was pitch black. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding. I didn't know if I should try to find a way in or leave. The rational part of me thought there was no way up. I'd heard from neighbors that there used to be a staircase inside, but it got destroyed when the church was torn down. I decided to circle around the tower and see if there was some hidden door. I took my time checking every angle, but all I found were more cracks, more faded scribbles, and a few small holes in the brick. There was no visible entrance. I left that night feeling uneasy. My skin felt prickly, and I kept looking over my shoulder on the walk home. When I got back, I locked the door and tried to sleep, but every noise outside made me snap awake. I don't think I got more than an hour of rest. The next morning, I felt exhausted and irritable. I tried to forget about the tower, but I couldn't. It felt like it was lingering in my mind, almost like a pressure behind my eyes. Over the next few weeks, I kept hearing the bell. Sometimes it was just a single ring that jolted me out of bed. Other times it was a long series of tolls that made me feel sick to my stomach. I started to get headaches whenever the bell rang. I got used to waking up at odd hours and walking to the window. I could see the tower in the distance, just standing there under the moonlight. It never moved, never changed, but I felt it pulling me, inviting me in a silent, uncomfortable way. I tried to talk to a couple neighbors about it. They said they'd heard stories but never heard the bell themselves. Some of them laughed it off. Others gave me strange looks and changed the subject. Eventually, I decided I needed to find a way inside. I don't know why, but I felt like I wouldn't be able to rest until I knew what was up there. So one afternoon, I went to the tower in broad daylight. I had a crowbar with me. I figured if there was some sealed door or hidden hatch, maybe I could pry it open. When I arrived, the sun was high and the sky was clear. The tower looked ordinary in the daylight. I noticed some graffiti near the base. It was the usual stuff, names and random drawings. I went around the back and started tapping on the bricks to see if there was a hollow spot. After a while, I found a patch of brick that sounded different. I tested it with the crowbar and realized it might be loose. So I pried a few bricks out one by one until I made a hole big enough to squeeze through. Inside, it smelled damp and stale. Dust floated in the air. I was standing in what looked like a small chamber with a dirt floor and thick stone walls. There was hardly any light. The only brightness came from the hole I'd created and a few narrow cracks near the top of the walls. I shined my flashlight around and saw what might have been remnants of old wooden beams or supports. They were rotted and broken. In one corner, I saw what looked like a staircase made of concrete, but most of the steps were crumbled away. The staircase led upward, but it was completely missing several steps near the bottom. I saw no safe way to climb it without risking a bad fall. I stayed in that chamber for a few minutes, walking around slowly. My hands were sweating, and I felt a sense of pressure in my temples. I heard soft sounds like whispers, but I couldn't tell if they were real or just the wind moving through the cracks. The walls had more symbols on them, the same odd marks I saw outside. Some were scratched into the stone. Others looked like they were painted. My throat felt dry. I coughed and the sound echoed. I decided to look for anything that could help me reach the upper level, but I only found old planks that broke the moment I touched them. There wasn't a ladder, rope, or anything like that. After about 10 minutes, I heard something that sounded like a faint creak overhead. I froze, listening. Then I heard a light tap, tap, tap. It sounded like footsteps, but it was too soft to be sure. I shouted to see if anyone was there, but all I got was my own voice echoing back. I pointed my flashlight up the hollow center of the tower. I could see part of the staircase winding around the interior wall, but it disappeared into darkness. I tried to see if the bell was visible from inside, but I couldn't. I felt a sudden chill, and the hair on my arms stood up. My pulse hammered in my neck. I felt vulnerable in that enclosed space. It felt like the walls were too close, even though the chamber was relatively open. My breathing became shallow. I decided to leave. I squeezed back through the hole and replaced a few bricks as best I could. Then I hurried home, gripping the crowbar the whole way. That night, the bell rang again. The first toll sounded around midnight. I woke up with sweat on my forehead. I felt a knot in my stomach. I got up, splashed water on my face, and stood in my kitchen, staring out the window. My apartment building overlooks the street, so I had a clear view of the empty road leading to the tower. Something about the night air felt heavier than usual. I told myself I wouldn't go back there alone at night. But after the fourth or fifth ring, I felt compelled to move. My body felt like it was on autopilot. I threw on a pair of jeans, grabbed my flashlight, and left. Walking through the neighborhood at that hour was unnerving. The silence made every small noise stand out. My own footsteps sounded too loud. When I reached the chain-link fence, I noticed a fresh scratch on one of the metal posts. It looked like someone had dragged something sharp along it. I pulled the gate open and heard the squeak. The tower loomed above me. The bell rang again, so close that my teeth vibrated. I shined my flashlight on the walls, hoping I wouldn't see any movement. But I saw nothing. I walked around to the hole I had made earlier. The bricks were still loose. I pushed them aside, crouched down, and slipped inside. The chamber was cold. I could hear my heart in my ears. I aimed my flashlight at the remains of the staircase. It was just as I'd left it, but I noticed a pile of small stones on one of the remaining steps. It hadn't been there before. I approached carefully. The stones were arranged in a neat row. My hands started to tremble. I nudged one of the stones with my foot, and it fell off the step. It clacked on the floor, echoing. The bell rang again, and it sounded much closer. It felt like it was coming from just above me. I steadied myself. I looked around for something, anything, that could help me climb. In one corner, I saw a couple of long metal rods lying against the wall. They looked like they might have been part of a support structure. I grabbed one and tested its weight. It felt sturdy. I leaned the rod against the broken staircase, bracing it between two solid steps. Then I put my foot on it and gave it a little pressure. It held my weight. I felt crazy for doing this, but I swung my other foot onto the step above. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it in my temples. Slowly, I climbed, using the rod as a makeshift rung. It was slippery from the dust and grime, but I managed to climb a few steps. I reached a point where the stairs were still intact. I shined my flashlight upwards. The tower's interior was a tight spiral. The space smelled musty. I heard faint tapping sounds again, but I couldn't locate the source. Every step I took made a grinding noise. Tiny bits of cement fell away. I kept going, gripping the inner wall for support. After maybe 24 steps, I reached a small landing. The bell rang again. It was so loud that my head rang with it. My flashlight flickered. I tapped it, and it stayed on. I looked around and noticed more faded symbols on the wall. They were bigger here, scratched deep into the stone. I touched them and felt the rough edges. The surface was cold and damp. Then I heard another creaking sound above me. It was like something brushing against the bell. I felt my jaw clench. I aimed the flashlight upward and saw a wooden platform a few feet above. I guessed that was where the bell was hung. I climbed the remaining steps. My knees felt wobbly and my hands were slick with sweat. When I reached the platform, my flashlight illuminated the bell. It was large and dark, covered in patches of rust. A thick rope hung from its interior, but the rope was frayed and looked like it hadn't been used in ages. I stayed still, listening for any sign that someone was up there with me. My breathing sounded too loud. My chest felt tight. The bell didn't move, but the faint smell of metal and old rope filled the air. I stepped closer, shining the light around. The platform was just wide enough for a single person to stand. There was no sign of a ladder to the top of the bell or any mechanism to ring it. I reached out and touched the bell. It felt cold, and my fingers left smudges on the dusty surface. The rope hung limp. I pulled it gently, and the bell barely moved. It would have taken a strong yank to make that thing ring. I knew I couldn't have heard it ring if nobody was pulling that rope. But I had heard it, many times, just minutes earlier. As I stood there trying to understand what was happening, I heard the echo of the bell again. It sounded below me, or maybe behind the walls. The vibration made my nerves flare. My eyes were watering, and I realized I was blinking too fast. I felt an urge to back away. My legs shook, and my lips were dry. My thoughts raced with questions, but I couldn't think clearly. My only instinct was to leave. I wiped my sweaty hands on my jeans and turned toward the staircase. The floorboard under my foot squeaked, and I paused, afraid it would break. I inched my way back down, clinging to the wall. Each step felt like it might collapse beneath me. When I finally reached the bottom, I pushed through the hole in the wall and stumbled outside. The cold night air hit my face and I gulped it in. My heart was still beating too fast. I dropped the metal rod next to the fence and hurried out. I didn't care if I left footprints or evidence of my break-in. I just wanted to be away from that place. I walked home without looking back. The bell didn't ring again that night, but I felt a dull ache in my head until morning. Ever since then, I've stayed away from the tower. I still hear the bell, though. Sometimes it rings for a long time, other times just once. I no longer try to explain it. Whenever it starts up, I sit in my apartment, turn on every light, and wait it out. My hands grip the edge of my couch, and my teeth grind together. The sound triggers a tension that spreads through my shoulders, and I can't relax until it stops. I've tried earplugs, white noise, even music, but nothing drowns out that deep, heavy tone. I don't know what's in that tower or how the bell keeps ringing. I only know that I've seen it up close, and I didn't find any logical explanation. I'm just a guy who thought he could solve this by poking around with a flashlight and a crowbar. All I have to show for it are unanswered questions and a lingering tightness in my chest whenever I hear that bell. Now, every time I pass by the tower during the day, I pretend it's not there. I focus on the sidewalk in front of me and walk faster. At night, I shut my curtains and try to distract myself with mindless TV. But the sound still comes. It makes me tense up, and it reminds me of those dark, cramped steps and that silent bell that shouldn't be ringing. I hate admitting it, but I'm scared. and I don't think it's ever going to leave me alone. I almost left the bazaar without looking at the last table near the exit. I had my new stack of bazaar books and a slight headache from the cramped aisles and the musty air. Then I saw the chest. It had dark velvet lining along its edges and strange markings around the latch. It was big enough for my growing collection. It looked old, but I could see no cracks or chipped corners. I touched the velvet. It felt smooth and cold. My stomach tightened. I didn't see a price tag, so I waved the seller over. He raised his eyebrows and said I could take it for half of what I expected. I didn't bother to ask why. I nodded, paid, and carried it to my car. I heard a scraping sound from inside the chest, but I told myself it was just a loose hinge or a piece of metal shifting. I drove home without thinking much about it. I was focused on the arrangement of my shelves and how I would use the chest. I carried it up the 3 flights to my apartment, then placed it in the living room. I set it against the wall near the coffee table. I opened it, ran my hand along the interior velvet, and found nothing special. I wanted to wipe it down, but I was hungry, so I closed it and went to the kitchen. I heard a faint melody behind me. It sounded like tiny bells. I turned around. The chest was closed. I walked over, put my ear near the latch, and listened. I couldn't hear anything else, so I shrugged and went back to my food. That night I lay in bed, feeling the dryness in my mouth from the day's dust and stale air. I was drifting off when I heard that same tiny bell sound. It was more distinct than before. I sat up. My heart thumped in my chest. The melody rose and fell. There was no pattern I recognized. It just repeated a few notes, then paused, then repeated them again. I got up, my feet pressing against the cold floor, and I crept to the living room. I realized I wasn't sure what I was planning to do. I flipped on the light and saw the chest sitting there. It looked motionless, but the melody felt closer. I put my ear to the lid and the sound got louder. I flipped the latch, opened the lid, and looked inside. Empty. The velvet looked normal. There were no hidden compartments. I tapped my knuckles against the wood. Solid. I couldn't figure it out. I closed it again. The music stopped. I felt a chill on my arms and a tightness in my shoulders. I moved the chest to a different spot, thinking maybe I was picking up some weird echo from somewhere. I even checked the walls and under the sofa for any old devices or speakers. Nothing. I went back to bed. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling in my stomach. I forced myself to sleep. The next morning I had coffee and stared at the chest. It just sat there. The velvet looked dark and clean. The arcane symbols around the edges had small lines and loops. They reminded me of runes I'd seen in some of my stranger books, but I never studied them closely. I decided to load some of my older, odder tomes into the chest. I placed them carefully, stacking them in rows. The interior smelled a bit like old fabric and cedar. I closed it and waited. No music. I double-checked the latch. Everything looked fine. That entire day I heard nothing. I felt a bit foolish for getting spooked. I watched TV in the evening and even used the chest as a footrest for a moment. The next night, I woke at 2 a.m. I heard the melody in the darkness. It wasn't a pleasant tune. The notes were off-key. Some parts sounded slower, others sped up. I sat up in bed, my pulse jumping. My neck felt stiff and my hands were clammy. I hesitated, then got up and walked toward the living room. The melody was louder this time. My mouth was dry, and I heard my breathing quicken. I flicked the living room light on. The chest looked the same as always, but the melody was coming from inside it, no doubt about it. I opened the lid again. The music stopped the moment I lifted it. I shifted the books around, flipped them over, and checked for any mechanical device. Nothing. I pressed my hand against the velvet in every corner. I felt nothing. I ran my fingers along the seams and along the wood. I didn't see anything that could produce sound. I even looked for small holes in the wood. There were none. I closed the lid. The melody resumed, but not immediately. It started up a few seconds later. I opened the lid again. Silence. My chest felt tight. My arms trembled. I spoke out loud, telling myself there had to be a normal explanation, but I couldn't find one. At that point, I realized I was sweating. My pajamas were clinging to my back. I decided to leave the lid open overnight. Maybe that would help. I tried to sleep. An hour later, I heard the melody again. This time it drifted from the living room. I rushed in. The lid was still open. The melody came from inside, but it didn't stop. I leaned over, stared into the velvet, and felt a wave of nausea in my gut. My heart pounded. The sound was right there, yet nothing was producing it. I closed the lid, stormed back to my bedroom, and forced myself to stay under the covers until morning. By the next day, I felt exhausted. I skipped breakfast and went straight to check the chest. It was silent. I lifted it. The hinges moved smoothly. No hidden compartments, no string, no device. I sat at the kitchen table, tapping my fingers on the surface. I pulled up an online search about old chests with hidden music. I only found stories about normal music box mechanisms. I had no leads. I decided to place the chest in my closet away from sight to see if that helped me sleep. That night I tossed and turned. The closet door was closed, but I still heard the music. It was faint at first, then it got louder. The same haunting notes. I felt the hair on my arm stand up. My throat hurt and I clenched my teeth. My head throbbed. I went to the closet, grabbed the chest by the handles, and carried it out to the living room again. I thought maybe I'd put it on the balcony, but I was afraid of leaving it outside overnight. Instead, I set it by the front door. The music continued. My ears felt like they were buzzing. The pressure in my head was intense. I glanced at the chest. I noticed the arcane symbols near the latch. They seemed sharper, as though they had fresh scratches. My eyes darted over every inch. I couldn't tell if I was imagining that. My heart raced and I took a step back. I tried to calm myself. I told myself it was the same design as before. I grabbed my keys and walked out into the hallway for some air. The hallway light was dull and flickered sometimes. I could still hear the melody through the door. It sounded muffled but still strong. My hands shook. My breathing was ragged. I didn't know what else to do. I went back in, stared at the chest, and slammed my fist on the lid. The music didn't stop. It just kept going in that bizarre cycle of notes. I lifted the lid. It stopped. I kept the lid up for a long time. I even tried to jam a chair against it so it stayed wide open. I figured if it couldn't close, maybe the music wouldn't start again. I sat in the armchair across the room, dozing off. My eyelids felt heavy. Then, around 4 a.m., I heard the music. The chest was still open. The music echoed from inside the velvet walls. My chest felt tight, and I jumped out of my chair. I rushed to it, slammed it shut, and kicked it. Nothing changed. The music kept playing for another minute, then faded away on its own. My head pounded. I didn't fall asleep until dawn. I called in sick to work. My voice sounded shaky when I left a voicemail. I felt like I was losing it, but I had to do something. I carried the chest to my kitchen table. I got a flashlight and a screwdriver. I looked for any place I could unscrew the hinges or remove a panel. I found no screws, just old-fashioned metal pins. I tried to pry one loose. It bent, but the wood didn't separate. The chest stayed solid. I couldn't see any opening inside it. I probed the velvet and tugged on a corner. It was glued down well. No luck. I got a hammer and chisel, but I stopped. I was afraid of damaging the chest and releasing more problems. I took a deep breath and backed away. I brought the chest into my living room again. I set it on the coffee table. Then I decided to test something. I left it closed and turned on loud music from my stereo to see if I could drown out that melody. I blasted music for about 10 minutes, then I shut off my stereo. The chest's melody came back immediately, louder than before. My heart pounded so hard I felt my pulse in my temples. I covered my ears and paced around the room. It didn't help. Finally, I flipped the latch and opened the lid. Silence. I spent the rest of the day looking up phone numbers for antique restorers or specialists, but I didn't trust any random listing to handle this. I also felt embarrassed describing the problem. I decided to check some of my older tomes. They had references to runes and cursed objects sometimes. I spent hours flipping through them, scanning pages. I saw plenty of drawings that reminded me of the markings on the chest. Most were from old arcane traditions, but there was nothing that matched exactly. I started to sweat and shake. My fingertips felt numb. I was reading about archaic items that cause illusions or strange effects, but none of that confirmed anything about a repeating melody. I slammed my book shut. My eyes burned from staring at small print for too long. I felt hunger gnawing at me, so I made a sandwich. My hand was unsteady as I spread mustard on the bread. The chest was quiet for the moment. I tried to ignore it. I sat on my couch and ate, chewing slowly, glancing at the chest every few seconds. It stayed closed, and I heard nothing. After I finished eating, I stood up. I walked over and touched the velvet on the lid. It felt colder than before, but maybe my hands were just warm. I took a deep breath. My heart rate was steady. I decided to shower and get dressed. The water felt good on my skin. I tried to block out the memory of that eerie tune. I scrubbed my arms and turned the water to cold, hoping to shock my system into feeling normal. Later, I sat on my couch again. I stared at the chest. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, but I also felt a strange pull to figure it out. I got closer, leaned over, and opened the lid slowly. No music. The inside looked empty, except for the books I had placed there. I ran my hand along the fabric one more time. I paused when I felt a slight bump in the lining. I pressed harder, but it felt like solid wood underneath. I let out a shaky sigh and pulled my hand away. By midnight, I was trying to watch something on TV, but I couldn't concentrate. My stomach felt twisted and my eyes drifted to the chest every few seconds. Then the melody started again. My TV volume was low, so the tune cut right through it. It had the same repeating series of off-key notes looping over and over, a bit louder than before. My pulse raced. My face felt hot and my hands felt cold. I grabbed a blanket and walked to the front door. I stepped outside into the hallway and closed the door behind me. I heard the sound through the door. I cursed under my breath. My legs trembled. I couldn't block it out. I opened the door again and stepped inside. The chest seemed to be the source of everything wrong in my apartment. My arms felt tense. I paced back and forth. I worried about the neighbors hearing it, but it seemed like they didn't notice, or they didn't care. I approached the chest. The music grew louder. I placed my palm on the lid. The wood vibrated slightly against my skin. I drew in a shaky breath. My heart hammered, and I felt a tingling in my scalp. I opened the lid. Silence. I muttered a few curses and stood there. I felt sweat on my forehead. I flipped the lid down. The melody started again. My hands curled into fists. My head pounded. I lifted the chest and carried it to the closet again, shoved it in, and slammed the door. The music came right through the wood. My breath caught in my throat. I felt pressure in my chest. I walked back to the living room and sat on the couch, trying to steady myself. The melody kept going. I clenched my jaw until it hurt, but that didn't stop the sound. I grabbed my keys and walked out of my apartment, then down the stairs. I stood on the sidewalk outside. My entire body felt tense. My ears still rang with that melody. I stayed out there for a while. The air felt cool, and I started to calm down. I realized my arms were shaking. I rubbed them to get some warmth. When I finally headed back up, I paused at my door. I listened for the tune. I couldn't hear it through the door. Maybe it had stopped. I walked in carefully. My apartment was silent. I flicked on the lights and checked the closet. The chest was there, the lid closed. I stood still for a minute, just staring at it. I felt a dull ache in my head. My arms were covered in goosebumps. I realized I was breathing heavily again. I closed the closet door. I locked it with the small latch. I turned off the lights, went to my bedroom, and lay down, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts were racing, but I didn't hear the melody. My body felt stiff and sore from all the tension. I forced myself to close my eyes and wait for sleep, bracing for the moment that sound came back. For the rest of the night, I stayed awake, listening to my own heartbeat, trying not to jump at every creak in the apartment. The melody didn't return before sunrise, but I knew it would come again. I woke up this morning with a jolt, my heart pounding for no reason I could understand. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the strange heaviness in my chest. Then I looked at the mirror on my bedside table and saw a diagonal crack that hadn't been there yesterday. It was thin, but it sliced across the surface from the top right corner to the bottom left. I thought maybe I had bumped into it before going to sleep, but I couldn't recall doing anything like that. My room was still, and the curtains were half open, letting a streak of light hit the mirror. That's when I noticed a faint shape in the reflection, something blurred and translucent hovering behind my shoulder. I leaned in. My neck tensed, and a chill prickled along my arms. The shape didn't move. It just stayed there, as if it was staring through me. I twisted around to check my room, but nothing was behind me. When I turned back to the mirror, I felt my pulse throb in my throat. The shape was still there, a pale outline with no discernible face or features. I could only see a sort of shiver in the glass. I felt my mouth go dry. My first thought was that I was imagining things. My second thought was that maybe I needed coffee or a splash of cold water. But something in my gut told me to keep watching, so I did. I reached out and brushed my fingertips against the crack to see if I could tell how deep it was. It felt smooth, almost like it was part of the mirror from the start. I pressed my hand against the glass, and that's when I noticed the shape seemed to move slightly. It didn't walk or float, it just shifted as if reacting to my touch. I jerked my hand back. My breath caught in my throat and I swallowed hard. I turned away, hoping that when I looked back, it would be gone. I forced myself to stand up and head into the bathroom. I splashed water on my face, and the shock of the cold helped me focus. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked the same as always. Tired eyes, a faint shadow of stubble, a tense jawline. No cracks there, no shapes lurking. I exhaled in relief. Then I felt silly for reacting that way. I went back to my bedroom, my feet padding softly on the carpet, and looked at the mirror again. The crack was still there, of course, and so was that shape. It hovered in the same spot behind my reflection's shoulder. I bent down, trying to change the angle. The shape stayed in place. I reached out to pick up the mirror, planning to get a closer look. As soon as my hand closed around its edges, I felt an odd vibration run through my palm. I stopped breathing for a second. I couldn't place the sensation exactly. It was like a tremor, but it didn't feel like it came from me. I tightened my grip, and the shape became a bit clearer. It looked almost like a faint silhouette of a person, but there were no details. Its head seemed angled downward, as though it was looking at me with a blank stare. I set the mirror down abruptly. My heart was pounding again, and I could hear my breath in my ears. I looked around my bedroom, checking every corner, every shadow. Nothing moved. The room was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. I felt adrenaline pumping, my thoughts scattered, trying to figure out if I was losing it. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. I had to leave for work in an hour. I decided I didn't have the mental space to dwell on it right then. I got dressed, shoved the mirror into a drawer, and left my room without looking back. All day at work, I couldn't concentrate. I kept thinking about the shape and the crack. I answered calls and clicked through emails, but my mind was stuck on that image. Sometimes I'd close my eyes and still see it, a faint figure behind me, completely still, almost watching me. It made me shiver, even in my office under bright fluorescent lights. At one point, I found myself staring at my blank computer screen during a reboot. seeing a faint reflection of my own face. I half expected to spot that shape behind me, but I saw nothing. I was relieved and on edge at the same time, which made me irritable with my coworkers. My stomach churned every time I thought about going home. When I finally did return home that evening, I felt a tension in my shoulders. I flipped on the living room lights and stood still for a moment, listening. Nothing unusual. I walked into my bedroom, feeling my pulse pick up with each step. I opened the drawer. The mirror was there, exactly how I'd left it. The crack appeared longer than before, but I couldn't be sure. Maybe I was imagining that too. I placed it on my bedside table again. This time I took a deep breath and forced myself to look at my reflection. The shape was there behind me like that morning, and it hadn't changed. It made my stomach tense. My skin felt cold. I reached forward and tried to angle the mirror, hoping the shape would vanish. It stayed. I felt my neck muscles tighten, and my breath became shallow. Then I noticed something else. Tiny distortions along the edges of the crack. They looked like small twisted figures in the reflection, but I couldn't see them clearly. They were wriggling, as if trying to free themselves from the margins of the glass. I leaned closer, blinking to make sure I was seeing straight. My pulse hammered in my ears. The figures were so small that I couldn't make out arms or legs, just contorted shapes that wriggled back and forth. I felt a wave of nausea. It was like my reflection had these little movements happening inside it, separate from the rest of the room. I put the mirror down and stepped back. I tried to calm myself by walking around my apartment, turning on more lights, checking the kitchen and living room for anything out of place. Everything looked normal. I made a sandwich even though my appetite was gone. I chewed it without tasting anything. My legs shook under the table. My forehead was damp with sweat. The idea of going back to that mirror made my stomach clench. But I knew I had to look at it again or I'd never sleep. I returned to my bedroom. The air felt heavier, or maybe it was just my nerves. I picked up the mirror and held it in my lap as I sat on the edge of my bed. My hands trembled. I looked down and saw that shape behind me again. In the reflection, unmoving. Its presence filled my vision, even though it was just a vague form. I tried to steady my breathing, focusing on the details of the shape. It had a rounded top, maybe a suggestion of shoulders, but no distinct features. Then my gaze drifted to the crack itself. It seemed wider, as if the glass was about to split apart. And there were those small, twisted figures near the crack, writhing in slow motion. I felt a wave of panic build in my chest, and I set the mirror aside. I stood up too fast and almost tripped over my own feet. My heart raced. I walked to my bathroom and looked at my reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror again. It was just me. No cracks, no shapes. I stayed there for a while, just staring at my own eyes, trying to gain some composure. I washed my face with cold water until I started to shiver from the chill. Back in my bedroom, I thought about covering that cracked mirror with a towel or tossing it in the trash outside, but something kept me from getting rid of it. I had a sense that it wouldn't matter what I did. The shape was already in my head. The mirror belonged to me, or I belonged to it. That was the feeling I had, even though it made no logical sense. My hands were shaking, and my throat felt tight. I looked around, realized how quiet my apartment was, and decided I needed some noise. I turned on the TV in the living room to break the silence. The voices on the screen helped distract me for a while, but I found myself glancing at the bedroom door, thinking about that mirror on the table. Eventually, I got up the nerve to go back and look at it one more time before bed. This time, I kept the overhead light on and approached the mirror carefully. I stood in front of it and picked it up, holding it in front of my face. The crack was definitely larger. A thin line branched out from the diagonal, making a small web near the bottom corner. The shape stood there behind me just as before, and it felt even closer. I swear I could sense a slight coldness at my back. My scalp tingled. I looked at those tiny figures in the crack again. They twitched in a frantic way now, contorting and shifting as though they wanted to crawl out of the mirror's surface. My breath caught, and my eyes started to water. I placed the mirror face down on the table, turning it away from me. I rubbed my temples. My muscles felt knotted. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed, my eyes flicking from the ceiling to the shadowy shape of the mirror on the table. I thought about locking it away in the closet, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it again. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that translucent outline behind me, those little figures crawling at the edges of the crack. My arms felt cold and my stomach was in knots. The next morning I woke with a headache and a dull ache in my neck. The mirror was exactly where I'd left it. I forced myself to get out of bed and try to ignore it. I got dressed, chugged some coffee, and told myself I had to function. My reflection in the bathroom still looked normal, though I noticed dark circles under my eyes. When I returned to the bedroom, I glanced at the mirror out of the corner of my eye. I could see the crack had widened again. It extended toward the center now, branching out in thin veins. I shook my head, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't sure how glass could crack on its own so fast. I left for work, but my mind never left that mirror. I could barely focus on my tasks. My co-workers noticed I was jumpy and asked if I was feeling okay. I just nodded and forced a half smile. My lunch break came and went. I hardly ate because I felt too sick to my stomach. I thought about telling a friend or a neighbor what was happening, but I imagined how that conversation would go. I'd sound irrational. I couldn't even explain it clearly to myself. I wondered if it would be better to throw the mirror in the dumpster and forget it ever existed. That night, I tried. As soon as I got home, I grabbed a paper bag from under the kitchen sink. I marched to the bedroom, forcing my legs to move. My hands shook when I picked up the mirror. I didn't look at the reflection. I slid it into the bag, folded the top, and carried it down to the building's garbage bin. My heart thumped so hard that I felt dizzy. I dropped the bag into the bin, watched it land, and walked back upstairs. I locked my door and exhaled shakily, leaning against the wall. I felt lighter for a moment, thinking I'd finally gotten rid of it. My relief lasted about 20 seconds. Then a thought wormed into my head. What if it doesn't matter? I could still imagine that shape behind me. I paced around my apartment, flicking lights on and off, checking every corner. There was nothing. By midnight, I was exhausted. I managed to doze off on my couch. When I woke up the next day, I had a splitting headache. I dragged myself into the shower, letting the hot water run over me. For a few minutes, I almost felt normal,